They say you can't choose your family, but what happens when your family chooses and you're not on the list when that text came through? Just immediate family this Christmas. I stared at my phone for a full minute. My name wasn't there. After 36 years of being the invisible daughter, the backup plan, the one they only called when they needed something, I was officially uninvited from my own family's Christmas. I typed back 2 words, "Sure, enjoy." What they didn't know, I'd just inherited a $5 million ranch in Montana. And I wasn't spending Christmas alone. I flew in every person my mother ever looked down on, every relative she called not good enough, every friend she said wasn't worth my time. We had the Christmas of a lifetime, laughter, warmth, everything a real family should be. Then I posted the photos online, and my phone exploded. But here's what they really didn't know. My aunt didn't just die and leave me that ranch. She died alone because of them. And before this story ends, every single secret will come out. Stay with me, because revenge is just the beginning. My name is Lauren Price. I'm 36 years old, and I teach art at a community college in Seattle. Most people would say I have a quiet life, a small apartment with a view of the rain, a job I love, and a routine that suits me just fine. But quiet doesn't mean content. And lately, I'd been wondering if I'd spent my whole life trying to be small enough that nobody would notice when I disappeared. Growing up in Ohio, I learned early that there were 2 kinds of children in the Price family. There was Ethan Golden, charming, destined for greatness, and then there was me, the spare, the backup, the one who existed in the margins of every family photo, smiling politely while the camera focused on someone else. My mother Judith ran our household like a military operation. Every detail had to be perfect. Every holiday had to look flawless from the outside, no matter what was falling apart behind closed doors. She was the kind of woman who measured love in appearances. If something looked good, it was good. If it didn't fit the image she wanted to project, it simply didn't exist. My father Robert was gentle in the way that quiet men often are. He loved us, I think, in his own way. But he'd spent so many years avoiding conflict with my mother that he'd forgotten how to speak up when it mattered. He was the kind of father who would pat your shoulder and say, "It'll be okay," aye, even when he knew it wouldn't be. And then there was Ethan, successful real estate broker, the pride of the family, the one whose achievements were framed and hung on the living room wall. He wasn't cruel, not exactly. He just never questioned why he got everything while I got the leftovers. To him, it was the natural order of things. Every Christmas, the pattern was the same. We'd gather around the table in my parents' pristine dining room, and I'd sit at the corner, always the corner, while Ethan held court at the centre. The gifts told the story better than words ever could. Ethan would unwrap a new watch, a leather briefcase, a weekend trip to some resort. I'd get a generic candle set or a scarf still in its department store box, picked up at the last minute because someone remembered I existed. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was above needing their approval. But the truth is, it did matter. Every single time. I remember one particular Christmas when I was 28. I'd just gone through a divorce, quiet, painful, the kind that leaves you hollow. I'd called my mother a week before the holiday, hoping for some comfort, some sign that I mattered enough to be welcomed home when I was broken. "Don't bring your sadness here," she'd said. "It's the holidays, Lauren. We want it to be cheerful." So I'd stayed in Seattle, alone, eating takeout in my empty apartment, while my family posted pictures online of their perfect celebration. Ethan's arm around Mum, Dad carving the turkey, everyone smiling like I'd never existed at all. That was the year I promised myself things would change, that I wouldn't keep begging for a seat at a table that was never meant for me. But I had no idea how much would actually change, or what it would cost. Because that year I told myself I'd never let them make me feel invisible again. I just didn't know yet what that promise would require me to do. Understanding why I felt invisible took years. It wasn't just about forgotten birthdays or corner seats at Christmas dinner. It was about something deeper, something woven into the very fabric of how my family operated. My mother built her entire life around one question: what will people think? Every choice she made, from the colour of our front door to the careers she pushed us toward, was calculated to project success, respectability, the kind of family that other families envied. She didn't care if we were happy. She cared if we looked happy. And there's a difference. I remember when I was 23, fresh out of college with a degree in art education and a mountain of student loan debt. Ethan was finishing his MBA and the tuition bills were crushing my parents. Or, at least, that's what my mother said when she called me one evening, her voice tight with stress. "We're stretched thin, Lauren," she'd said. "Your father's business had a rough quarter. I don't know how we're going to manage Ethan's final year." I'd been saving for 3 years. Every paycheck from my part-time teaching job, every birthday check from distant relatives, every dollar I could scrape together had gone into a modest savings account. I'd been planning to use it for a down payment on a small apartment, something that would finally feel like mine. But when my mother asked, when she explained that Ethan's education was an investment in the family's future, I didn't hesitate. I transferred nearly $18,000 to cover his tuition. It emptied my account. It meant another 2 years of living with roommates, of putting my own life on hold. And do you know what happened after that? Nothing. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Not even a mention at the next family dinner. It was as if the money had materialised out of thin air, a miracle that required no gratitude because it was simply expected. I was the supporting character in their story, and supporting characters don't get recognition. They just do what they're supposed to do. Ethan graduated with honours. He got a job at a prestigious firm. My mother framed his diploma and hung it in the hallway where everyone could see it. She threw him a celebration party with catered food and champagne toasts. I wasn't invited to give a speech. Nobody mentioned that I was the reason he'd been able to finish. And when I finally brought it up casually, carefully, years later, my mother looked at me like I'd said something distasteful. "We're family, Lauren," she'd said, as if that explained everything. Family helps each other. But apparently, family only helped in one direction. Ethan never understood what he had. To him, success and money were the same thing as love. He genuinely believed that because he made 6 figures and drove a nice car, he was more valuable than I was. He'd look at my life, my modest apartment, my teacher's salary, my simple routines, and I could see the pity in his eyes. "You could have done more," he told me once, not unkindly. "You're smart, Lauren. You just didn't want it enough." He didn't understand that I wanted different things. That I measured my life in the students, I helped the moments of creativity, I fostered the quiet satisfaction of doing work that mattered. To him, those things didn't count. They didn't come with a title or a corner office or a salary that impressed people at parties. And the parties. God, the parties. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every milestone my mother would host these elaborate gatherings. The house would be spotless, the food catered, the decorations straight out of a magazine. Neighbours would come, colleagues would come. Everyone would ooh and ah over the presentation, the elegance, the perfect price family. I'd stand in the corner with a glass of wine watching my mother perform, watching her laugh at jokes that weren't funny, compliment people. She'd trash talk the next day, pretend that everything in our family was as golden as the lighting she'd hired a professional to install. Ethan would work the room like a politician, shaking hands, making connections, being charming in that effortless way that came naturally to him. My father would hover near the bar, smiling politely, saying little. And I'd wonder why I was even there. Because the truth was, I wasn't there for me. I was there because my absence would have raised questions. An empty seat at the table would have cracked the facade. So I showed up, year after year, playing my role as the dutiful daughter who smiled and nodded and never made a scene. I told myself it would get easier, that eventually I'd stop caring, that I'd build a life so full and so separate from them that their opinion wouldn't matter anymore. I was wrong. Because no matter how far I moved or how much distance I put between us, there was always a part of me that wanted them to see me. Really see me. Not as the supporting character, not as the backup plan, but as someone who mattered. I wanted to matter. And then, one cold November evening, as I sat in my Seattle apartment grading papers and half watching the rain streak down my window, my phone buzzed. A text message from my mother in the family group chat, and then that message came. I set down my red pen and picked up my phone, expecting the usual family group chat noise. My mother sometimes sent links to recipes she'd never actually make, or my father would forward jokes he found on Facebook. Harmless, forgettable. But this message was different. It was from my mother, time-stamped at 7:42 in the evening. The preview on my lock screen showed just the first line, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. This year, just immediate family for Christmas. I unlocked my phone with trembling fingers. The full message read, "Hi everyone, your father and I have decided to keep Christmas intimate this year, just immediate family for the holidays. We hope you understand. Looking forward to a quiet celebration. Love, Mum. Immediate family." I read it 3 times, trying to parse what that meant, trying to convince myself there was some interpretation I was missing, some technicality that would include me. Then I scrolled up through the group chat to see who was in it. Mum, Dad, Ethan, and a number I didn't recognise but could guess Sarah, Ethan's fiancée. She'd been added to the family chat 2 months ago when they got engaged, welcomed in with exclamation points and heart emojis. 4 people. I counted again, hoping I'd somehow miscounted. 4 people. That was the immediate family. My name wasn't on the list. I wasn't in the count. I had been sitting in this group chat for years, receiving messages about family dinners I wasn't invited to, plans that didn't include me, updates about Ethan's life that no one thought to ask about mine. And now, this. Just immediate family for Christmas. The implication was so clear, so brutally efficient, that I almost admired the cruelty of it. My mother hadn't said, "Lauren, we're not inviting you this year." She hadn't given me the dignity of a direct conversation or even a private message. She'd simply redefined what family meant, and I didn't make the cut. I sat there on my couch, my laptop balanced on my knees, papers scattered around me, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just a vast, hollow silence where something used to be. My phone buzzed again. Ethan had replied, "Sounds great, Mum. Sarah and I will bring wine." Then Dad. Looking forward to it. 3 little dots appeared under my mother's name. She was typing. "Perfect. Dinner at 6. Don't be late." She added a smiley face. I stared at that smiley face for a long time. It felt obscene somehow, like she was signing off on my erasure with a cheerful little emoji, as if this was nothing, as if I was nothing. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to type so many things. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to point out that I'd shown up for every single holiday, every birthday, every family obligation for 36 years, and this was how they repaid me. But what would be the point if I protested? I'd be the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who couldn't just accept a simple decision without making it about herself. My mother would sigh and say something like, "We just wanted a quiet holiday, Lauren. Don't take it personally." Except it was personal, devastatingly, undeniably personal. So instead, I typed 2 words. "Sure, enjoy." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The message appeared in the chat looking small and pathetic beneath their enthusiastic responses. Nobody replied to it. Nobody asked if I was okay, or if I had other plans, or if I needed anything. The conversation moved on without me, just like it always did. I set my phone face down on the couch and stared at the wall. The apartment was too quiet. Outside, rain hammered against the window, in sheets the way it always did in Seattle in November. The sky had been grey for weeks, and it would stay grey for months. Sometimes I liked the rain. It felt honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. But tonight, it just felt heavy. I thought about all the Christmases I'd endured, all the times I'd flown back to Ohio, spending money I didn't have on last-minute plane tickets, because I thought it mattered, because I thought showing up was what family did. I thought about sitting at that corner of the table, smiling through another dinner where nobody asked about my life, where the conversation revolved around Ethan's latest deal, Ethan's new car, Ethan's engagement, Ethan's everything. I thought about the gifts I'd carefully chosen for each of them, spending hours trying to find something meaningful, something that would show I cared. And I thought about the generic candles and scarves and gift cards I'd received in return, still in their store packaging tags barely removed. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone 3 years ago telling me not to bring my sadness to Christmas, about my father's silence when I needed him to speak up, about Ethan's oblivious privilege, his assumption that he deserved more simply because he was him. And I realised something. I was done. Not angry done. Not dramatic storming off done. Just quietly, irrevocably done. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to spend one more ounce of energy trying to convince people to love me who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. I picked up my phone again and opened my email. There was a message from a lawyer in Montana forwarded from an old address. I'd almost deleted it as spam a few weeks ago, but something had made me open it. It was about Aunt Mary, my mother's older sister, the one we never talked about, the one who'd been erased from family photos and family stories, excommunicated for reasons my mother refused to discuss. Aunt Mary had died in December of last year, and she'd left me something. A ranch, 400 acres in Montana. The lawyer had been trying to reach me for months, but the paperwork had gotten lost in forwarding addresses and outdated contact information. By the time I'd finally responded, probate was nearly closed. I'd inherited it all. The land, the house, everything. I hadn't told my family. I didn't know why, exactly. Maybe some instinct told me to keep it to myself. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear my mother's reaction, to hear her diminish it, or explain it away, or find some reason why I didn't deserve it. Or maybe deep down I'd known this moment was coming. I opened the lawyer's most recent email. He'd sent photos of the property. It was beautiful, sprawly, the kind of place you saw in magazines with mountains in the distance and endless sky, the kind of place where you could start over. I looked back at the group chat, at my mother's message, at the smiley face that had dismissed me so casually, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for a seat at their table anymore. I was going to build my own. I opened a new text message and started typing. Not to my family, to other people. People my mother had looked down on. People she'd called not good enough. People who'd been pushed aside just like me. People who deserved a real Christmas. My hands were steady now. My mind was clear. I was done being invisible. What they didn't know was that I wasn't the same girl anymore. The change didn't happen overnight. It started almost a year ago in the last days of December, when I got a phone call that should have come much sooner. I was at school cleaning paintbrushes after my last class, before winter break, when my phone rang. Unknown number. Montana area code. I almost didn't answer. "Is this Lauren Price?" a man's voice asked. "Yes. This is Thomas Brennan. I'm an attorney in Missoula. I've been trying to reach you regarding the estate of Mary Catherine Price." I froze, my hand still wet with paint thinner. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "Whose estate? Mary Price, your aunt. I'm very sorry for your loss. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. Aunt Mary was dead. I hadn't even known she was sick. I hadn't known anything about her life for the past 20 years, because my mother had made sure of that. Mary was my mother's older sister, and from what little I'd pieced together over the years, they'd had some kind of falling out when I was a teenager. One day, Aunt Mary was part of our lives, funny, warm, the kind of aunt who sent birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside, and the next she was gone, erased. Her name became something we didn't mention. When I was 16, I'd asked my mother what happened. Mary made her choices. Mum had said, her voice cold and final, "We don't talk about her." That was it. End of discussion. And over the years, I'd learned not to ask. But now, she was gone, and apparently she'd left me something. "I don't understand," I told the lawyer. "When did she die?" "December 15th, he said gently. I looked at the date on my phone. December 28th. That was almost 2 weeks ago. "Yes, I apologise for the delay in reaching you. The contact information we had on file was outdated. Your mother informed us that you were travelling and difficult to reach." My mother had known. She'd known Aunt Mary died and she hadn't told me. She'd let me miss the funeral. She'd let me miss everything. "I see," I said, my voice hollow. "I understand this is a difficult time," the lawyer continued, "but there are some time-sensitive matters regarding the estate. Your aunt left you her property in Montana, all of it. Property, a ranch, 400 acres including the main house, a guest cottage and several outbuildings. It's quite substantial. We'll need to discuss the details, but I wanted to reach you before the end of the year for tax purposes." I stood there in my empty classroom surrounded by student artwork and the smell of paint trying to process what he was telling me. Aunt Mary had left me a ranch. When I finally got home that night, I called my mother. "Oh, Lauren," she said when I told her I'd heard from the lawyer. "I was going to tell you, everything just happened so fast." "Fast," I repeated. "It's been 2 weeks." The funeral was very small, just a local service. Mary didn't want a big fuss. I would have come. "Well, it's over now." Her tone was brisk, dismissive. "I'm sure you're shocked about the property. Mary always was unpredictable." "Why did you cut her off, Mum?" Silence. "That's ancient history, Lauren. There's no point digging it up now." But I was going to dig it up. I needed to understand who Aunt Mary had been and why she'd chosen to leave everything to me. I flew to Montana in January. The ranch was 3 hours outside Missoula, tucked into a valley surrounded by mountains that took my breath away. The house was old, but solid, built with timber and stone, the kind of place that had weathered decades and would weather decades more. Inside, I found pieces of Aunt Mary everywhere. Quilts she'd sewn, books with her notes in the margins, photographs of a life I'd never been allowed to know about, and letters, dozens of them bundled with ribbon and stored in a cedar chest. Letters from my father. I sat on the floor of her bedroom and read them all. They went back 20 years, starting not long after Aunt Mary had vanished from our lives. They were brief, careful, but consistent. Dad sent her updates about me, about my life, about the things I was doing, the person I was becoming. Lauren got her teaching certificate this year. One read, "She's so proud. I thought you'd want to know." Another, "Lauren's going through a hard time. I wish I knew how to help her. I think she needed you." And near the end, just a few months before Aunt Mary died, "She's still trying to earn Judith's approval. I don't think she'll ever see that it's impossible. I hope someday she understands that she's enough, just as she is." I cried reading those letters, not just because my father had cared enough to write them, but because Aunt Mary had kept them. Every single one. She'd held on to these pieces of my life, even though we'd been kept apart. In her will, she'd left a note for me, short and handwritten. Lauren, this place gave me peace when I needed it most. I hope it does the same for you. Build something beautiful here. You deserve that. Love, Aunt Mary. I decided sitting in that quiet house, surrounded by mountains, that I would honour her wish. I took a leave of absence from teaching. I used my savings and a loan against the property to hire contractors. For 10 months, I poured everything into transforming that ranch. We renovated the main house, updated the guest cottage, built a commercial kitchen, installed heating systems that could handle Montana winters. I didn't tell my family. Not my mother, not Ethan, not even my father, though I suspected he'd understand. I kept it secret because I knew exactly what would happen if they found out. My mother would find a way to diminish it. Ethan would offer unsolicited advice about property value and investment strategies. They'd make it about themselves, about how it reflected on them, about what they thought I should do with it. And I didn't want their opinions. I didn't want their approval or their judgment or their attempts to control something that was finally, completely mine. By October, the ranch was finished. It was more than I dreamed. 5 bedrooms in the main house, each with its own fireplace. The guest cottage had been converted into a cozy retreat. The property appraised at just under $5 million, though I had no intention of selling. This wasn't an investment. It was a refuge. I'd spent my whole life making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, hoping that would be enough to earn a place in my family. But Aunt Mary had given me something they never had. She'd given me a place where I already belonged. And now, sitting in my Seattle apartment with that text message still glowing on my phone, I realised what I needed to do. I opened my contacts and started scrolling. The people my mother had called beneath us, the relatives she'd cut off, the friends she'd deemed not good enough for the Price family image. I started typing invitations, real ones, personal ones. I know it's last minute, but I'd love to have you for Christmas at my place in Montana. It would mean a lot to me. One by one, they responded. Surprised, touched, grateful. By midnight, I had 15 people confirmed. 15 people who understood what it meant to be excluded. 15 people who'd been told they didn't matter. We were going to have the Christmas my mother never let us have. And when it was over, when the photos were posted and the truth came out, my family would finally understand what they'd lost. Maybe this Christmas that ranch would finally tell the truth. As I sent the last invitation and set my phone down, something shifted inside me. Not regret, not doubt, but a kind of reckoning with why this moment felt so necessary. I'd been telling myself for years that I was fine, that I'd moved past needing my family's approval, that I'd built a good life despite them, not because of them. But the truth was messier than that. The truth was that some wounds don't heal just because you ignore them. They sit there quietly bleeding, waiting for a moment like this to remind you they were never really closed. I thought about the Christmas that broke something fundamental in me. 3 years ago. The worst year of my life. I'd gotten married when I was 30. His name was Michael, and he was kind in the beginning. Steady. The kind of man who seemed safe after a lifetime of feeling uncertain. My family approved of him, which should have been my first warning. My mother loved that he was an accountant, that he wore nice suits, that he fit the image she wanted to project. But 2 years into the marriage, I realised I'd made a terrible mistake. Michael wasn't unkind, but he was absent. He worked late every night, came home exhausted, and we lived like roommates who happened to share a bed. I tried to talk to him about it. I suggested counselling. I begged him to make time for us. He said I was asking too much, that I was too needy, that I should be grateful for what I had. By the time I turned 33, I knew I couldn't stay. The divorce was quiet and quick. No drama, no fighting, just the slow, sad dismantling of something that had never really been built right in the first place. I moved out in November into a tiny apartment in a part of Seattle I couldn't really afford. I was alone for the first time in years, and the loneliness was crushing. Not because I missed Michael exactly, but because I'd failed at something my family valued. I'd failed at being the kind of woman who made marriage look easy. 2 weeks before Christmas, I called my mother. I needed to hear her voice. I needed someone to tell me it would be okay. I started crying the moment she answered. Not loud, dramatic crying, just quiet tears that I couldn't hold back. "Lauren, what's wrong?" "I'm just having a hard time, Mum. The divorce is final and I'm alone, and I don't know. I thought maybe I could come home for Christmas. I need to be around family." There was a pause, a long one. Then she said it, the words that I've never been able to unhear. "Lauren, don't bring your sadness here. It's the holidays. We want it to be cheerful." I stopped crying. Just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. "What? You understand, don't you? Christmas is supposed to be joyful. Your father and I work very hard to create a nice atmosphere. Ethan's bringing his girlfriend, and we want it to be festive. You can come if you want, but please try to be upbeat. Don't make it about your problems." "My problems," I repeated slowly. "You know what I mean. We all go through hard times, Lauren, but we don't have to burden everyone else with them." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was giving me reasonable advice instead of telling me that my pain was inconvenient, that my presence in my current state would ruin her perfect holiday tableau. "Okay," I said quietly. "I understand. Good. So, we'll see you on Christmas Eve." "No, Mum. I don't think I'll make it this year." "Oh. Well, if you're sure, we'll miss you." But she didn't sound like she'd miss me. She sounded relieved. I hung up and sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at the wall. It was bare. I hadn't even unpacked yet. Boxes were stacked everywhere, and my bed was just a mattress on the floor. I didn't go home for Christmas that year. I told myself it was my choice, but the truth was, I'd been uninvited. Politely, with a smile in her voice, but uninvited all the same. Christmas Eve, I went to the grocery store and bought instant ramen and a bottle of cheap wine. The store was almost empty. Everyone else was home with their families, I assumed. Wrapping presents, baking cookies, doing all the things that families were supposed to do. I went back to my apartment and ate noodles out of a pot while sitting on my mattress. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't play music. I just sat there in the silence trying to convince myself that this was fine, that I was strong enough to be alone. Around 8 o'clock, I made the mistake of opening Facebook. There they were, the photos. My mother had posted an album titled Family Christmas Eve. There was the tree professionally decorated. There was the dining room table set with china and crystal. There was Ethan with his arm around his girlfriend, both of them laughing. There was my father carving a turkey, my mother raising a glass of champagne. Everyone looked radiant, happy, like they were living in a commercial for the perfect American family. The caption read, "Blessed to spend this beautiful evening with the people who matter most." I stared at that phrase for a long time. The people who matter most. I wasn't in any of the photos. My name wasn't mentioned in the comments. It was as if I'd never existed, as if my absence was so insignificant that it didn't even warrant acknowledgement. I closed the app and lay down on my mattress staring at the ceiling. I told myself I wouldn't cry. I'd cried enough, but the tears came anyway, hot and angry and full of a grief I couldn't name. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number, Montana area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Hello? Lauren? It's Aunt Mary." I sat up so fast I got dizzy. "Aunt Mary. I know it's been a long time, honey, too long, but I've been thinking about you and something told me I should call tonight. Are you okay?" I wanted to lie, to say I was fine, but her voice was so warm, so genuinely concerned that I couldn't. "No," I whispered. "I'm not okay." "Tell me." So I did. I told her about the divorce, about my mother's reaction, about spending Christmas alone in an empty apartment while my family celebrated without me. I told her everything, and she listened, really listened. She didn't interrupt, she didn't offer platitudes. She just let me speak. When I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lauren, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. You deserve a family that shows up, honey. Not just when it's convenient. Not just when you're happy and successful and easy to be around, but when you're broken and scared and don't know what comes next. That's when family matters. And if your family can't do that, then they're not really family at all." I started crying again, but this time it felt different, cleaner somehow. "I don't know how to stop needing their approval," I admitted. "You will," she said gently. "One day, you will wake up and realize you don't need it anymore. And when that day comes, you'll build something better, something real." We talked for another hour. She told me about her ranch, about the life she'd built after leaving Ohio. She told me she'd thought about reaching out years ago, but didn't want to cause trouble with my mother. "I regret that now," she said. "I should have fought harder to stay in your life." "It's not your fault," I told her. "Maybe not, but I'm fighting now. You call me anytime, Lauren, day or night. You're not alone." After we hung up, I felt lighter. Not healed exactly, but less broken. That was the last time I spoke to Aunt Mary. 2 months later, she was gone. But her words stayed with me. You deserve a family that shows up. Sitting in my apartment now 3 years later, with 15 invitations sent and a ranch waiting in Montana, I finally understood what she meant. My mother's love had always come with conditions. I had to be successful, but not more successful than Ethan. I had to be present, but not needy. I had to fit into her vision of what our family should look like, and there was no room in that vision for the messy, complicated, hurting parts of me. I'd spent my whole life trying to meet those conditions, trying to be good enough, trying to earn a love that was never freely given. But I was done trying, and that's when the idea started forming. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside me, making a list. Not a list of grievances, though I could have filled pages with those. This was different. This was a list of people. People my mother had dismissed. People who'd been on the receiving end of her particular brand of cold exclusion. People who knew exactly what it felt like to not be good enough for the Price family. I started with family. My father's sister, Aunt Carol, who lived in a trailer park outside Cleveland. My mother always made excuses for why we couldn't visit her. "It's too far. We're too busy." But I knew the real reason. Carol was poor, and my mother was embarrassed by that, as if poverty were contagious. As if being seen with Carol would somehow tarnish our carefully curated image. I found Carol's number in an old address book and called her, my heart pounding. She answered on the third ring. "Hello, Aunt Carol, it's Lauren, Robert's daughter." "Lauren?" Her voice brightened immediately. "Oh my goodness, honey, it's been 10 years? How are you?" "I'm good. I'm actually calling because I wanted to invite you to spend Christmas with me. I have a place in Montana now and I'm having a gathering. Nothing fancy, just people I care about. I'd really love it if you could come." There was a long pause. "Montana, Lauren, that's so kind, but I couldn't possibly. The plane ticket alone." "I'm covering everything," I said quickly. "Flights, everything. Please, it would mean a lot to me." Her voice cracked a little. "You'd do that?" "Of course, your family." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, I could hear tears. "Your mother stopped inviting me to things a long time ago. I always wondered if it was something I did. It wasn't you, Aunt Carol. It was never you." "I'd love to come," she whispered. "Thank you for thinking of me." After I hung up, I sat there feeling something warm spread through my chest. It felt good. It felt right. Next on my list was Margaret Chen, my college roommate. She'd been my closest friend during those years, but my mother had never approved of her. Margaret's parents ran a small grocery store and she worked nights to help pay for school. My mother called her rough around the edges and suggested I spend more time with girls from better families. I'd been too weak to stand up to her then, too afraid of causing conflict. Margaret and I had drifted apart after graduation, not because of any fight, just the slow fade that happens when you stop putting in effort. I found her on social media and sent a message. She responded within an hour. "Lauren Price, I haven't heard from you in forever. Montana. That sounds amazing. Are you serious about paying for the flight? Because I'd love to see you again." We ended up on the phone for an hour catching up. She told me about her life, her job as a social worker, her recent breakup. And then, carefully, she said something that made me ache. "Your mum never liked me, did she?" I closed my eyes. "No, she didn't, and I'm sorry I didn't stand up to her. I should have." "We were young," Margaret said softly, "but I always wondered if that's why you stopped calling." It was, and I hate that I let her influence me like that. You were a better friend than I deserved. "Well," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Maybe we can make up for lost time. I'm definitely coming to Montana." The list grew. Tom and Susan Hartley, the neighbours from our old street in Ohio. They'd been friendly, kind people who'd always waved and offered to help with yard work. But their house was smaller than ours, their cars older, and my mother had made it clear we weren't to get too familiar with them. When they invited us to a backyard barbecue, once my mother declined with a polite excuse, and later told me, "We don't socialise with people like that." I called them. Susan answered, and when I explained who I was, she laughed in surprise. "Little Lauren Price, I remember you. You used to draw chalk pictures on the sidewalk." "I did," I said, smiling at the memory. "I'm calling because I'd like to invite you and Tom to spend Christmas with me. I know it's short notice, but..." "Oh, honey, we'd love that. Tom's been saying we need a real vacation. He'll be thrilled." When I mentioned my mother, Susan's tone shifted slightly. "Your mother was always very proper," she said carefully. "We tried to be good neighbours, but I don't think we were quite what she had in mind." "You were kind," I said. "That's what mattered, and I'm sorry she didn't see that." By midnight, I had 12 confirmations. Aunt Carol, Margaret, the Hartleys, my father's old work friend Dennis, who'd been quietly pushed out of our lives after he lost his job, my high school art teacher, Mrs. Kim, who'd encouraged my creativity when my mother insisted I pursue something more practical, a cousin on my mother's side who'd come out as gay and been met with icy silence at family gatherings. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: surprise, gratitude, and then, hesitantly, a story about my mother, about feeling judged, about not being good enough, about being excluded from the warm centre of the Price family orbit. I listened to every story, and with each one I felt more certain that this was exactly what I needed to do. These weren't random people. They were casualties of my mother's need to maintain appearances. They were the people who'd been deemed unworthy of our time, our attention, our respect, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because they didn't fit the image my mother wanted to project. And yet, talking to them now, I realised something profound. These people had more warmth, more genuine kindness, more real love in their voices than I'd heard from my own family in years. My mother had taught me that family was about bloodlines and obligations and maintaining the right image. But Aunt Mary had taught me something different. Family is who shows up. Family is who sees you at your worst and loves you anyway. Family is who makes room at the table instead of finding reasons to shrink it. These people, these beautiful, flawed, imperfect people my mother had rejected, were showing up. They were saying yes. They were willing to fly across the country to spend Christmas with someone they hadn't seen in years just because I'd asked. That was family, the real kind. By 2 a.m, I had 15 confirmed guests. 15 people who deserved to feel wanted. 15 people who'd been told in one way or another that they didn't matter. I was going to show them they did. I looked at the list on my laptop at all those names and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. This Christmas wasn't about hurting my mother or proving a point. It was about creating something real, something honest, something that honoured what Aunt Mary had built on that ranch, a place where everyone belonged. And just like that, my Christmas list was full again. I flew to Montana a week before Christmas, my suitcase full of decorations and my mind full of plans. The drive from Missoula to the ranch took 3 hours through snow-dusted mountains, and by the time I pulled up to the property, the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The ranch looked like something out of a dream. The renovations had transformed it, but the soul of the place remained unchanged. This was still Aunt Mary's home. I could feel her presence in every beam and board. I spent the first evening just walking through the rooms, reacquainting myself with the space. The main house had a large living room with a stone fireplace that stretched to the ceiling. In the corner sat Aunt Mary's old rocking chair, the one she'd sat in while reading or knitting or just watching the mountains. I'd had it reupholstered, but I'd kept the frame exactly as it was. Sitting in it now, I could almost feel her there with me. The kitchen still had her old cast-iron stove, which I'd restored rather than replaced. It was impractical maybe, but it felt important to keep it. I remembered the letters my father had written, mentioning how Mary loved to bake bread on Saturday mornings, how the whole house would smell like yeast and butter. I wanted to preserve that. I wanted this place to remember her. Outside, even under a layer of snow, I could see the outline of her rose garden. She'd planted it herself, according to the neighbours I'd spoken with during renovations. 40 different varieties, each one carefully chosen and tended. It was dormant now, waiting for spring, but I'd already decided I would learn to care for it. I would keep it alive for her. As I moved through the house, hanging garlands and stringing lights, I found myself thinking about all the Christmases I'd missed here, all the years Mary had lived alone in this beautiful place, while I'd been sitting at my mother's table pretending to be grateful for scraps of attention. What would it have been like if I'd known about this place sooner, if I'd been allowed to visit, to build memories here with the one person in my family who'd actually seen me, but my mother had made sure that never happened. She'd cut Mary out so completely that I hadn't even known where she lived. And now, Mary was gone, and all I had were letters and photographs and the echoes of a relationship I'd been denied. The anger came in waves. I'd be hanging a wreath or arranging candles, and suddenly I'd have to stop and breathe through the rage. At my mother, at the years stolen from me, at the cruelty of being kept from someone who'd loved me. It wasn't the first time my mother had sabotaged my happiness, just the most permanent. I was 25 when I met David. He was a musician, which my mother immediately hated. Unstable, she called it, not a real career. But David was gentle and funny, and he saw something in me that I'd started to think didn't exist. He made me feel like I mattered. We'd been dating for 6 months when I started thinking about a future with him. Marriage, maybe. A life built on something other than appearances and obligations. Then one night, David came to my apartment looking shaken. "Your mum called me," he said. I felt my stomach drop. "What?" She said she needed to talk to me about something important, so I met her for coffee. "David, I'm so sorry." Whatever she said, she told me you're not stable. His voice was quiet, confused. She said you've had depression, that you've struggled with commitment, that I should think very carefully about getting serious with you because you're not ready for marriage. I stood there frozen. My mother had told him things I'd shared with her in confidence, private things, painful things. She'd weaponized my vulnerability to destroy the one relationship that had made me happy. That's not... I started, but I could see in his eyes that the damage was done. Doubt had been planted. We lasted another month, but something had broken between us. He'd look at me sometimes like he was waiting for me to fall apart, like he was watching for proof that my mother had been right. When he finally ended it, he was kind about it. "I just don't think we're in the same place," he said. But I knew the truth. My mother had poisoned him against me. When I confronted her, she was unapologetic. "I did it for your own good, Lauren. That man was not right for you. He had no stability, no prospects. You would have been miserable." "That wasn't your decision to make. I'm your mother. It's my job to protect you from making mistakes." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "Your job was to love me, to support me, not to sabotage every chance I had at happiness." She'd looked at me like I was being dramatic, unreasonable. "You'll thank me someday," she said. She never apologized. Not then, not ever. Standing in the ranch kitchen, now I felt that old wound open again. How many times had she done this? How many times had she decided what was best for me without asking? How many opportunities for love, for connection, for a different life had she quietly destroyed? I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge. Was that what this Christmas was about? Was I trying to hurt her the way she'd hurt me? Was this revenge dressed up as compassion? I didn't think so, but I wasn't entirely sure. The truth was messier than that. Yes, I wanted her to see what she'd thrown away. I wanted her to understand that the people she deemed unworthy had more love and warmth than she'd ever shown me. I wanted her to feel a fraction of the exclusion I'd felt my entire life. But more than that, I wanted to create something real. I wanted to honour Aunt Mary's memory by filling this house with the kind of people she would have welcomed. People who understood what it meant to be pushed aside. People who deserved to belong. Maybe both things could be true. Maybe justice and compassion weren't opposites. Maybe you could want someone to understand the harm they'd caused while still choosing kindness over cruelty. I walked back to the living room and sat in Aunt Mary's rocking chair looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "I hope I'm doing this right," I whispered to the empty room. "I hope you'd be proud." The house was quiet, just the creak of the chair and the soft whistle of wind outside. I thought about the 15 people coming here in a few days, people who'd been told they weren't good enough, people who'd been excluded and dismissed and made to feel small. We were all going to have Christmas together. We were all going to belong. And if my mother happened to see it happen, to realise what she'd lost, well, that wasn't revenge. That was just the truth finally being told. I stood up and went back to decorating hanging lights around the window, setting candles on the mantel. The house was starting to look like Christmas. Not the sterile, perfect Christmas of my mother's house, but something warmer, something real. I whispered to myself, to Aunt Mary, to anyone listening, maybe I don't need their approval anymore. The words felt true, powerful, like something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was ready for this Christmas, ready to move forward without carrying the weight of my family's expectations. But fate had other plans. Fate's plan arrived in the form of Aunt Carol, who was the first to land at the Missoula airport 2 days before Christmas. I picked her up in the rental SUV I'd gotten specifically for shuttling guests back and forth. When she came through the arrivals gate, pulling a battered suitcase held together with duct tape, I barely recognised her. It had been so long. But when she saw me, her face broke into the biggest smile, and suddenly I remembered exactly who she was. Lauren. She dropped her suitcase and pulled me into a hug that smelled like drugstore perfume and coffee. "Look at you, all grown up and beautiful." I hugged her back, surprised by how emotional I felt. "Thank you for coming, Aunt Carol." "Are you kidding? I haven't had a real Christmas in years. This is the best gift anyone's given me." On the drive to the ranch, she talked non-stop, telling me about her life, her job at the grocery store, her small apartment. She didn't complain exactly, but I could read between the lines. Money was tight. Life was hard. She was lonely. When we pulled up to the ranch and she saw the house lit up against the mountains, she went quiet. "Oh, Lauren," she breathed, "this is yours." It was Aunt Mary's. She left it to me. Carol turned to me with tears in her eyes. Mary always had good instincts about people. She knew you were special. Over the next day and a half, the others arrived in waves. Margaret flew in from San Francisco looking exactly the same, except for laugh lines around her eyes. The Hartleys drove from Ohio, their car packed with Tupperware containers of homemade cookies. Dennis brought a box of old photographs he thought I might want to see. Mrs. Kim brought art supplies, just in case anyone wants to paint. Each arrival felt like a small reunion. These were people who'd known me or known of me, or had been touched by my family's rejection in some way, and each one walked into the ranch with the same expression of wonder. My cousin Jamie arrived on Christmas Eve morning. She was my age, and I'd barely known her growing up because after she came out at 18, my mother had quietly removed her from the guest lists. Jamie stood in the entryway holding a bottle of wine and looking around with something like disbelief. "I thought your mum said you were struggling," she said. I blinked. "What?" "Last year, when I asked about you at Thanksgiving, your mum said you were going through a hard time, that you were barely making ends meet. I thought..." She stopped, realization crossing her face. "She lied, didn't she?" "Apparently." Jamie shook her head slowly. "Of course she did. Can't have anyone knowing that the disappointing daughter actually landed on her feet." By Christmas Eve afternoon, all 15 guests had arrived and the ranch had transformed into something I'd never experienced before. The house was full of noise, good noise, laughter and conversations overlapping and music playing from someone's phone in the kitchen. Aunt Carol had taken over the stove, teaching 3 other women how to make her famous pierogi. Margaret and Mrs. Kim were in the living room with sketch pads drawing the view through the window. The Hartleys were outside building a snowman, with Dennis, all of them laughing like children. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching it all, and something in my chest cracked open. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not carefully staged, just real, messy and warm, and full of people who were happy to be together, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. Aunt Carol looked up from the stove and caught my eye. She set down her spoon and walked over, flour dusting her hands. "Come here," she said, pulling me into another hug. I hadn't expected to cry, but suddenly I was. Quiet tears that I tried to wipe away, but Carol just held on tighter. "Your Aunt Mary would be so proud of you," she whispered. "She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone in that family. And look at this. Look at what you've built here." I didn't build anything, I managed. I just invited people. "You built this," Carol said firmly, gesturing around the kitchen. "You created a place where people feel welcome, where they feel seen. That's not nothing, honey. That's everything." By evening, someone had started cooking in earnest. It wasn't a formal dinner, just everyone contributing what they could. Tom Hartley made his grandmother's green bean casserole. Jamie roasted vegetables. Margaret put together a salad. I made Aunt Mary's stuffed peppers, working from a recipe card I'd found in her kitchen drawer. We ate family-style passing dishes around a table that barely fit everyone. People sat on the couch with plates in their laps. Some stood by the fireplace. It was chaotic and perfect. Mrs. Kim raised her glass of wine. "I'd like to make a toast." Everyone quieted down. "To Lauren," she said, "for reminding us what Christmas is actually supposed to be about. Not perfection, not appearances, just love. Thank you for including us." "To Lauren," everyone echoed, and I felt my face flush. "And to Aunt Mary," I added quietly, "for giving us this place to gather." To Mary. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Someone started a fire in the fireplace. Dennis pulled out a guitar I didn't know he played and started strumming Christmas carols. Some people sang along, others just listened. The room glowed with firelight and contentment. I was sitting on the floor near the tree when Margaret slid down beside me. "This is really special," she said softly. I can't remember the last time I felt this relaxed on a holiday." "Me either." She pulled out her phone and snapped a quick photo of the room. People scattered around the fire, crackling, the tree lights twinkling. "You should post this," she said, showing me the photo. "Let people see what real family looks like." I looked at the image. It captured everything. The warmth, the authenticity, the joy. It was so different from the staged, perfect photos my mother always posted. This was real. "I don't know," I said. "It feels private." "It is private," Margaret agreed, "but it's also beautiful. And maybe someone out there needs to see that family doesn't have to look like a magazine spread, that it can be messy and imperfect and still be full of love." I stared at the photo for a long moment. I thought about my mother's text message, just immediate family. I thought about being excluded, erased, made to feel like I didn't matter. I thought about the 15 people in this room who'd all been told in one way or another that they weren't good enough. And I thought about Aunt Mary, who'd built this place as a refuge, who told me to build something beautiful. "You're right," I said finally. "People should see this." I took Margaret's phone and looked at the photo again. Then I opened Instagram on my own phone, uploaded the image, and wrote a simple caption. "Family is who shows up." My finger hovered over the post button. I knew I shouldn't. I knew this would open a door I couldn't close. I knew my family would see it and there would be consequences. But maybe that was the point. Maybe they needed to see what they'd thrown away. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. I hit post and set my phone face down on the floor beside me, my heart hammering. Margaret squeezed my shoulder. "Good for you," she said quietly. Around us, the party continued. Dennis was playing a soft version of Silent Night on the guitar. Aunt Carol and Mrs. Kim were reminiscing about teaching, comparing stories about difficult students, and rewarding breakthroughs. Tom Hartley was showing Jamie photos of his grandchildren on his phone. No one knew what I'd just done. No one knew I'd just lit a match and tossed it toward a pile of kindling. I tried to focus on the moment, on the warmth of the fire and the sound of people I cared about enjoying themselves. But my phone sat there beside me like a small bomb ticking. I lasted about 5 minutes before I picked it up again. 3 likes already, then 5, then 12. I watched the number climb, refreshing the screen even though I knew I shouldn't. 20 likes. 30. The comments were starting too. "This is beautiful." "Where is this? What a gorgeous space. You're so lucky." "This is what the holidays should look like." I felt a weird mix of pride and anxiety. I'd never posted anything that got this kind of attention before. My Instagram was mostly pictures of student artwork and Seattle coffee shops. Nothing personal, nothing that mattered. But this mattered. Margaret leaned over to look at my screen. "It's taking off," she said. "Look at that. 50 likes, 70. Comments pouring in from people I hadn't talked to in years, former students, old colleagues, friends from college. Then I saw it. A comment from someone named Jennifer Walsh, one of my mother's friends from her book club. "Judith, is this your Lauren? What a stunning property." And she tagged my mother's account. My stomach dropped. "Oh no," I whispered. Margaret saw it too. "Did she just..." "Yeah." I stared at that tag and my mother's Instagram handle, highlighted in blue. Jennifer had essentially sent up a flare making sure my mother would see this. Whether it was intentional or innocent didn't matter. The result was the same. "Maybe she won't check her phone tonight," Margaret offered. "It's Christmas Eve. She's probably busy with her own party." But I knew better. My mother was always on her phone. She monitored her social media like it was her job, carefully curating her image, responding to comments with a practiced warmth, making sure everyone saw exactly what she wanted them to see. She'd see this. Soon. I should have put my phone away. I should have stayed present with my guests, enjoyed the evening, dealt with whatever came later. But I couldn't stop watching. The likes kept climbing. 100, 150. People were sharing it now, reposting it to their stories with captions like, "This is the energy I need for the holidays," and "Real family goals." More comments flooded in. The caption, though, so true. "I want to be invited to this Christmas. Can we talk about how beautiful this house is?" Then 20 minutes after Jennifer's tag, I saw my mother's account appear in the viewer list. She'd seen it. My mouth went dry. I waited for a comment, for some public response. But nothing came. She'd just looked, just seen it, and said nothing. Somehow, that felt worse. Around me, the party had shifted. Someone had brought out a board game. People were choosing teams, laughing about the rules. The noise level had increased, everyone's voices competing in that happy way that happens when people are comfortable with each other. I forced myself to set my phone down again, to participate, to play the game and laugh at the right moments and pretend everything was fine. But every few minutes, I'd glance at my phone. The post was still growing. 200 likes. 300. It had somehow jumped beyond my immediate circle and was being shared by people I didn't know. Strangers were commenting about the house, the gathering, the caption that apparently resonated with more people than I'd expected. Family is who shows up. Such a simple sentence, but judging by the responses, it had hit a nerve. I needed to hear this today. Crying because this is so true. My family hasn't spoken to me in 2 years because I came out. This gives me hope. I hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected my small act of defiance to mean something to strangers. But there it was, thread after thread of people sharing their own stories of family rejection, of being deemed not good enough, of finding their real family in chosen relationships rather than blood ties. By 11 o'clock, as some of the guests started heading to bed, the post had over 500 likes. It had been shared dozens of times. My phone was buzzing constantly with new notifications. Jamie plopped down beside me on the couch. "You're suddenly Instagram famous, Ushi," she said, nodding at my phone. "What'd you post?" I showed her. She scrolled through the comments, her eyebrows rising. "Lauren, this is blowing up. And, oh..." She stopped. "Your mum's friend tagged her." "I know." "Has she said anything?" "No." She just looked at it. Jamie handed my phone back. "She's probably figuring out how to respond. You know Aunt Judith, she'll want to say exactly the right thing, or she'll say nothing publicly and call you privately to destroy you." She said it lightly, but we both knew it was true. "I shouldn't have posted it," I said. "No," Jamie said firmly. "You absolutely should have. Look at these comments. Look at how many people this is reaching. You told the truth, and truth matters." By midnight, most of the guests had gone to their rooms. The house was quiet, except for the crackle of the dying fire. I sat alone in the living room, my phone in my hands, watching the post continue to spread. 700 likes, 800. Someone had shared it to a popular page about family dynamics and healthy boundaries. Now people who didn't know me at all were commenting, sharing their own stories, thanking me for the reminder that family could be chosen. It had become something bigger than I'd intended, something that wasn't just about me and my family anymore. I thought about my mother, presumably lying in bed in Ohio staring at these same photos. Seeing the beautiful house she didn't know I owned. Seeing the people she'd dismissed, gathered together, happy and warm and clearly having a better Christmas than anything she'd planned. Seeing proof that I'd moved on without her. Part of me felt guilty. This wasn't supposed to be about hurting her. It was supposed to be about building something real, something good. But another part of me felt justified. She'd spent my whole life making me feel small, invisible, not good enough. Maybe it was time she understood what that felt like. My phone screen lit up with a new notification. But this time, it wasn't a like or a comment or a share. It was a phone call. "Mum." My heart stopped. I stared at her name on the screen, the phone buzzing in my hand. It was 12:15 on Christmas morning. She should be asleep. She should be pretending this didn't exist. But she was calling, and the phone started ringing. I let it ring twice more before I answered. My hand was shaking. Hello? What the hell do you think you're doing? My mother's voice was ice. Not loud, not hysterical, just cold and sharp and cutting. I'd heard that voice before. It was the voice she used when she was truly angry but didn't want to appear out of control. The voice that could slice through you without ever raising in volume. Merry Christmas, Mum. Don't you dare act cute with me right now. I just spent the last hour fielding phone calls from people asking me about your little display on Instagram. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I closed my eyes. Of course, her first concern was embarrassment, not curiosity about where I was or who I was with, not questions about the ranch or Aunt Mary, just embarrassment. I posted a photo of my Christmas celebration, I said quietly. I don't see how that's embarrassing. You know exactly what you did. You posted photos of some elaborate property that you never mentioned owning, surrounded by people we don't even know, with a caption clearly designed to make your father and me look bad. This is manipulative, Lauren. It's cruel. I didn't mention you at all. You didn't have to. Family is who shows up. After we explained that we wanted a quiet, intimate Christmas, everyone can read between the lines. You're publicly shaming us. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark mountains. The snow was falling again, soft and silent. I'm not shaming anyone. I'm just celebrating Christmas with people who wanted to be here. Where even is this? Whose house is that? It's mine. Aunt Mary left it to me when she died. Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then quietly, dangerously, Mary left you a property worth millions, and you didn't think to tell your family. No, I didn't. Why not? Because it's none of your business, and because I knew exactly how this conversation would go. How dare you? Her voice finally rose. How dare you keep something like this from us? We're your family, Lauren. We have a right to know about major developments in your life. Like you told me Aunt Mary was dying. Like you told me when she went into the hospital. Like you let me know in time to say goodbye. Another silence. Colder this time. That was different. How? Mary made her choices. She cut us off. I wasn't going to force a reunion on her deathbed. She didn't cut us off, Mum. You cut her off. And then you made sure I couldn't have a relationship with her either. You kept us apart for 20 years. I did what I thought was best. For who? Not for me. Not for her. For you. You did what made you comfortable, what protected your image, what let you pretend she didn't exist. This is not about Mary. My mother's voice was sharp again. This is about you deliberately trying to hurt me. Delete those photos, Lauren, right now. No. Excuse me. I said no, I'm not deleting them. Lauren Elizabeth Price, I am your mother, and I am telling you to delete those photos immediately. Something about hearing my full name, about being spoken to like I was a child being disciplined, made something snap inside me. I'm 36 years old. I said, my voice steady. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. You don't get to control my life or my choices or who I spend my time with. You sent that text message uninviting me to Christmas, and I made other plans. That's all this is. You're being spiteful. I'm being honest, maybe for the first time in my life. She started to respond, but I heard muffled voices in the background. My father, maybe, or Ethan. Your brother wants to talk to you, she said, and before I could respond, the phone was being passed. Lauren. Ethan's voice was sharp, angry in a different way than my mother. What the hell is wrong with you? Merry Christmas, Ethan. don't. Just don't. I cannot believe you would pull something like this. Do you have any idea what you've done? I posted a photo. You humiliated Mum and Dad in front of everyone they know. Their friends are calling asking questions. People are commenting on Mum's page. You made us look like terrible people. I didn't make you look like anything. I just shared my own Christmas. With a caption specifically designed to make us look bad, family is who shows up. Are you serious? That's so passive-aggressive, it's pathetic. Miss, the truth. The truth, his voice went up. You want to talk about truth? The truth is, you're jealous. You've always been jealous that I was more successful, that I had my life together while you were struggling. And now you inherited some property from an aunt none of us even knew, and you think that makes you better than us. I felt something hot and sharp rise in my chest. Anger. Real anger. This isn't about you, Ethan. For once in your life, not everything is about you. Then what is it about? Why post something like this if not to hurt us? Because I wanted to share something beautiful with people who've been told they don't matter. Because I wanted to celebrate with people who actually wanted to be there. Because I'm tired of pretending that our family is something it's not. Our family is fine. You're the one with the problem. You're the one who's bitter and jealous and can't stand that Mum and Dad wanted a quiet Christmas without all the drama you bring. Drama I bring. I almost laughed. Ethan, I haven't caused drama. I just stopped showing up to be ignored. There's a difference. You're being ridiculous and selfish. Do you know what this is doing to Mum? She's upstairs crying right now because her daughter publicly humiliated her on Christmas. I didn't mention her. You didn't have to. Everyone knows what you meant. Everyone can see you're trying to make us look bad. Or maybe, I said slowly, everyone can see the truth. That I built something beautiful without you. That I found family in people you dismissed. That I'm actually happy and that has nothing to do with any of you. Happy? Ethan's laugh was bitter. You're not happy, you're petty. This whole thing is just pathetic revenge because you didn't get invited to one Christmas. You're right. It was one Christmas. The last one. The one where I finally understood that I don't need to keep begging for a place at a table that was never meant for me. What's that supposed to mean? It means I just celebrated with my family. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could hear breathing. Could feel the weight of those words landing. I just celebrated with my family, not our family, not the Price family, my family, the one I'd chosen, the one that had chosen me back. You're unbelievable, Ethan finally said, his voice tight. I'm done, Ethan. I'm done trying to be good enough for people who decided a long time ago that I wasn't. Merry Christmas. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. But I felt something else too. Something lighter. Relief. I'd said it. I'd finally said what I'd needed to say for years. I sat back down on the couch, my phone in my lap. I waited for it to ring again, for my father to call, for my mother to call back, for the barrage to continue. But the phone stayed silent. I looked at the Instagram post one more time. Over 1,000 likes now, hundreds of comments, people sharing their own stories, finding solace in those 5 simple words. Family is who shows up. I'd meant it as a statement, a simple truth. But that simple line changed everything. Christmas morning arrived with surprising peace. I'd barely slept, expecting my phone to explode with more calls, more anger, more demands. But there was nothing, just silence from Ohio and the gentle sounds of my guests waking up, moving through the house, starting coffee. I came downstairs to find Aunt Carol already in the kitchen, pulling together ingredients for pancakes. Mrs. Kim was setting the table. Tom Hartley was building up the fire. It was domestic and easy, and for a moment I could almost forget the war I declared the night before. Margaret found me standing in the doorway. You okay? She asked quietly. I don't know yet. They called, didn't they? Yeah, both my mum and Ethan. It was bad. She squeezed my arm. But you're still standing. Barely. We spent Christmas morning the way I'd always imagined Christmas should be. Opening small gifts we'd exchanged, laughing at inside jokes, drinking too much coffee, eating Carol's pancakes, which were somehow both burned and undercooked. It was imperfect and wonderful. Around 11, my phone buzzed. A text message from my father. Your mother wants to come talk to you in person. We're flying out this afternoon. We'll be there tomorrow. I stared at the message, read it 3 times. Margaret looked over my shoulder. Oh, yeah. Do you want them to come? I don't think it matters what I want. They're coming. I typed back. Okay. Nothing more. Just okay. Let them come. Let them see this place, these people, this life I'd built without them. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a strange blur. I was present but distant, laughing at the right moments, but always aware of the clock ticking down. My guests didn't know what was coming. I didn't tell them. I wanted them to enjoy this without the shadow of my family drama hanging over everything. That evening, after another communal dinner, after more games and stories and the kind of easy togetherness I'd never experienced before, I slipped outside onto the porch. The mountains were dark against a sky full of stars. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat on the porch swing, trying to prepare myself for tomorrow. Jamie found me there 20 minutes later. Your family's coming, aren't they? She said, sitting beside me. How did you know? You've been quiet all day, and you have that look people get when they're bracing for impact. I smiled despite everything. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows what it's like. When I came out, my mum flew across 3 states to talk to me about my choices. I know that particular flavour of dread. What happened? She tried to convince me I was wrong, that I was confused, that I was throwing my life away. And when I didn't back down, she left and didn't speak to me for 2 years. Jamie pulled the blanket tighter. But eventually, she came around. Not all the way. Not perfectly. But enough. Do you think my family will come around? I don't know, but I know you're doing the right thing. Standing up for yourself isn't cruel, Lauren. It's necessary. The next day, December 26th, I woke with a knot in my stomach. My guests were planning to leave over the next few days, but most were still here enjoying a lazy post-Christmas morning. I'd arranged for a rental car to be dropped off, telling everyone I had some errands to run, that I'd be back soon. I didn't tell them I was going to pick up my family from the airport. The drive to Missoula felt longer than usual. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd act, trying to find the right balance between strength and compassion. But every practice conversation in my head fell apart. Their flight landed at 2. I stood in arrivals, watching passengers stream out, looking for my family. I saw my father first. He looked smaller somehow, older. He was pulling a suitcase and scanning the crowd with a worried expression. Then came Ethan, typing on his phone, his jaw set. And, finally, my mother. Perfectly dressed, even after a long flight. Her face carefully neutral. When my father spotted me, relief crossed his face. Lauren? I walked over. Hi, Dad. He hugged me, brief and awkward. My mother stood back, not moving. Ethan barely looked at me. Let's go, my mother said. We need to talk. The drive back was silent, except for my father's attempts at small talk. How long have you had this place? Is the drive always this pretty? I answered in short sentences, keeping my eyes on the road. Ethan sat in the back with his arms crossed, staring out the window. My mother sat in the passenger seat, her purse on her lap, her hands folded so tightly, her knuckles were white. As we got closer to the ranch, I could see her taking in the landscape. The mountains, the open space, the kind of beauty that couldn't be faked or staged. When I turned onto the long driveway leading to the house, I heard her sharp intake of breath. The ranch looked like something out of a dream in the afternoon light. The main house with its timber and stone, the guest cottage with smoke coming from the chimney, the mountains rising behind everything like sentinels. I'd left lights on in the windows. The Christmas decorations were still up. It looked warm and welcoming and exactly like the photos I'd posted. I parked near the front entrance. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, my mother opened her door and stepped out. She stood there, staring at the house, at the property, at the sheer scope of what I owned. She looked stunned. Actually, stunned. Like she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Ethan got out next, his expression carefully blank. My father climbed out slowly, looking around with something like wonder. I got their suitcases from the trunk and walked to the front door. I could feel them behind me following, but nobody spoke. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, I could hear my guests in the kitchen, hear laughter and the clink of dishes. The house smelled like coffee and cinnamon. The fire was going. It was everything a home should be. I turned to face my family standing there on the porch. My mother's face was pale. Ethan looked uncomfortable. My father looked sad. I smiled, not smugly, not cruelly, just calmly. "Welcome to my home," I said. For the first time in my entire life, I saw something on my mother's face I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. She looked at me like she didn't quite know who I was, like I'd become someone she didn't recognize, someone she couldn't control. Ethan shifted his weight, his confidence wavering. My father just looked tired, and for the first time they looked unsure. I showed them to their rooms upstairs, the guest bedrooms I'd prepared just in case, though part of me hadn't really believed they'd come. My mother said nothing as she set her suitcase down, just looked around the space with that carefully controlled expression she wore when she was trying not to react. "Dinner's is at 6, I said. "We eat family style, casual." "Who's we?" Ethan asked, his first word since we'd arrived. "My guests, the people from the photos." My mother's eyes snapped to mine. "They're still here." "Some of them, yes. Most are leaving tomorrow." "Lauren, we came here to talk privately. As a family." "We will. But first, you'll have dinner with us. All of us." I left before she could argue. Downstairs, I found Margaret in the kitchen, helping Aunt Carol prep vegetables. They looked up when I came in, and Margaret immediately read my expression. "They're here, aren't they?" "Upstairs. They're staying for dinner." Aunt Carol's eyes widened. "Your mother is here, Judith, and my father and brother." "Oh, honey," Carol wiped her hands on a towel. "Are you sure about this?" "No, but it's happening anyway." The news spread through the house quickly. By the time 6 o'clock came around, there was a strange energy in the air. My guests knew who was upstairs. They knew what my family represented. And they were all in their own ways bracing for impact. I'd set the dining room table to fit everyone. 17 people total now. It was crowded, intimate in a way that wouldn't allow for polite distance. When my family came downstairs, the room went quiet. My mother surveyed the gathering, her face unreadable. My father offered a small, nervous smile. Ethan looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Everyone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is my mother Judith, my father Robert, and my brother Ethan. This is everyone else." There was a moment of awkward silence. Then Tom Hartley stood up and extended his hand to my father. "Robert, good to see you again. It's been years." My father's face showed surprise, then recognition. "Tom, I didn't realize that we were invited." Tom's smile was kind but knowing. "Your daughter has a bigger heart than most people." My mother didn't sit immediately. She stood there taking in the faces. I watched her recognize Aunt Carol and something flicker across her expression. Recognition, discomfort, maybe even shame, though she'd never admit it. "Please sit," I said, gesturing to the empty chairs I'd left at one end of the table. They sat. My mother was across from Aunt Carol with my father beside her and Ethan at the end. The positioning couldn't have been more deliberate if I'd planned it, though I hadn't. It just worked out that way. The first few minutes were excruciating. People passed dishes in near silence, made small talk that died quickly. My mother picked at her salad without eating. Ethan stared at his plate. Only my father tried asking Dennis about his work, commenting on the house. Then, Mrs. Kim, bless her, started telling a story about a disastrous pottery class where everything exploded in the kiln and slowly, gradually, the table came back to life. People laughed. Conversation picked up. My guests remembered how to be themselves. My family sat in the middle of it like stones in a river, the warmth flowing around them, but not quite reaching them. I'd made Aunt Mary's stuffed peppers for the main course. I'd found the recipe in her kitchen, written in her handwriting on a stained index card. It had taken me 3 tries to get it right, but I'd finally mastered it. The peppers were roasted until tender, filled with seasoned beef and rice topped with a tomato sauce that was slightly sweet, slightly tangy. When I brought the dish out, Aunt Carol gasped. "Oh my God, are those Mary's peppers?" "They are." "I haven't had these in 30 years. Her eyes filled with tears. She made them every Christmas. I served everyone, working my way around the table. When I got to my mother, I set the plate in front of her carefully. She stared at the pepper like it was a ghost. Her hand reaching for her fork trembled slightly. "Mary used to make these," my father said softly, looking at his own plate. "I remember." "She taught me," I said, "from her recipe cards." My mother still hadn't moved. Her face had gone pale. She was staring at the food like it was causing her physical pain. Aunt Carol, not knowing, or perhaps not caring about the tension, said, "Mary taught Lauren this. She was such a wonderful woman. So warm, so generous. I missed her terribly after..." She stopped, realizing what she was about to say. "After your sister cut her off," the sentence would have finished. The table went quiet again. Everyone suddenly very interested in their food. My mother picked up her fork, set it down, picked it up again. "I need some air," she said, abruptly pushing her chair back. "Mom," Ethan started. "I need some air," she repeated, her voice tight. She stood up and walked toward the back door, her movements rigid, controlled. But I could see it, the cracks forming, the composure slipping. My father half rose. "I should let her go." "Dad," I said quietly. He looked at me conflicted, then slowly sat back down. We could see her through the window, standing on the back porch, with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the dark mountains. Her shoulders were shaking. And then she lost her composure. My mother stood on that porch for maybe 3 minutes, though it felt longer. Through the window, I watched her wipe at her face, straighten her shoulders, rebuild the armor she wore like a second skin. When she came back inside, her eyes were red, but her jaw was set. She didn't sit down. She stood at the head of the table, looking directly at me. "You're mocking me," she said. Her voice was controlled again, but barely. "You made her recipe deliberately. You invited all these people deliberately. This whole thing is designed to humiliate me." The table went silent. Everyone's eyes moved between us like watching a tennis match. "I'm not mocking you," I said quietly. "I made a recipe that Aunt Mary taught me. That's all." "That's not all. You know exactly what you're doing. You're using her to get back at me. You're throwing her in my face with her recipes and her house and her..." Her voice cracked. "This is disrespectful, Lauren, to her memory and to me. Disrespectful." Something hot flared in my chest. "You want to talk about disrespect?" "Judith," my father said, his voice low and worried. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." She ignored him. "You posted those photos to embarrass me. You invited people you knew I wouldn't want to see. You're parading around this property like you've won some kind of prize. I inherited my aunt's home. I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. I celebrated Christmas with people who wanted to be here. That's not about you. Everything about this is about me. You're angry because we wanted one quiet Christmas, and this is your revenge. You're punishing me by showing off with Mary's things, Mary's house, Mary's recipes. She gestured wildly at the table. You barely even knew her, because you made sure of that. The words came out louder than I intended. The whole table flinched. My mother's face went white. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it to me. Explain why you cut her out. Explain why you kept us apart for 20 years. Explain why her name was forbidden in our house. Ethan stood up his chair, scraping loudly. What are you talking about? What do you mean, cut her out? He was looking at Mum, confusion clear on his face. And I realised suddenly that he genuinely didn't know. He'd been too young when it happened. He didn't remember Aunt Mary. He didn't know there was a history to unpack. Ethan, sit down, my mother said. No. What is Lauren talking about? You never mentioned Aunt Mary. I didn't even know Dad had a sister until the lawyer called about the estate. I had a sister, my father said softly. Mary. She was wonderful. Ethan looked between our parents. What happened to her? She died last year, I said, in December, and I didn't find out until after the funeral because Mom decided I didn't need to know. Ethan's head snapped toward our mother. What? It was complicated, Mom said, her voice tight. Mary and I hadn't spoken in years. It didn't seem necessary to involve Lauren in something that was already over. Not necessary. I stood up now too, my hands shaking. She was dying in a hospital and wanted to see me. She asked for me, and you told them not to contact me. Aunt Carol made a small sound of shock. Several other people at the table were staring at their plates, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. You don't know that, my mother said. I do know that, because Aunt Mary left me letters, because she left me everything, including the truth about what you did. My father's face had gone grey. Judith, he said quietly, tell me you didn't. I did what I thought was best. You kept her from saying goodbye. He said, and there was something broken in his voice. Mary asked for her and you kept them apart. Mary made her choice 20 years ago, when she... Mom stopped abruptly, seeming to realise she was about to say too much. When she... What? I demanded. What did she do that was so terrible you had to erase her from our lives? This is not the time or place. No, we're doing this now, right here. What did Aunt Mary do? My mother's hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She told me I was a terrible mother. She said I was cold and controlling and that I was going to drive you away. She said I treated you like you were less important than Ethan and that one day you would realise it and leave. And I told her that if she couldn't respect my parenting, she wasn't welcome in our lives. The words hung in the air like smoke. So she was right, I said softly. She told you the truth, and you cut her off for it. She had no right to judge me. She had every right. She loved me. She saw what was happening, and she tried to protect me. And you punished her for it. You punished both of us. I protected this family. And from what? From someone who cared. From someone who might have given me the love you couldn't. My mother's face crumbled for just a second before she rebuilt it. I loved you. I love you. Everything I did was because I love you. No, I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. Everything you did was because you needed control, because you needed everything to look perfect. And when Mary threatened that perfect image by telling the truth, you got rid of her. Just like you got rid of anyone else who didn't fit. That's not... Aunt Mary left me this ranch because Mum left her first. I said, looking at Ethan, at my father, at everyone at the table. She left it to me because for 20 years she wasn't allowed to be part of my life, because Mum decided her truth was more dangerous than her absence. Robert was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Is this true? All of it? Mum opened her mouth, closed it. Her hands were shaking now, really shaking, and for the first time in my life I saw her completely unable to construct a response that would make her look good. Judith, my father said again, his voice heavy, we need to talk about this. The silence that followed was deafening. That night, nobody slept well. I could hear movement throughout the house, creaking floorboards, doors opening and closing, the soft murmur of my father's voice trying to talk to my mother through her closed bedroom door, and her silence in response. I lay in my own bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner over and over. The look on my mother's face when she saw those peppers, the way her carefully constructed walls had finally cracked, the admission that Aunt Mary had been cut off for telling the truth. I thought that was the worst of it, that the revelation at dinner was the bottom of this painful excavation. I was wrong. Around 7 a.m, there was a knock on my door, quiet but urgent. Lauren, Ethan's voice. Are you awake? I sat up confused. Ethan hadn't voluntarily sought me out in years. Yeah, come in. He opened the door slowly. He looked terrible. His hair was dishevelled, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He was still wearing yesterday's clothes, wrinkled now, like he'd been up all night. We need to talk, or, he said. He came in and sat on the edge of my bed, his hand shaking slightly. He was holding a manila folder. I couldn't sleep. He started, his voice hoarse. After dinner, after everything Mum said, I kept thinking about the timeline, about when Aunt Mary died, about when you found out. I waited, my heart starting to pound. Something didn't add up. So, around 2 a.m, I went into Mum's room. Ethan. She was asleep. I knew she'd brought files with her legal stuff, because she always does when she travels. I thought maybe there'd be something about the estate, about Aunt Mary's will, something that would explain why she reacted the way she did. He opened the folder with trembling hands. I found this instead. Inside were papers, documents, letters. Start here, he said, handing me a hospital bill. It was from St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, Montana. Patient name, Mary Catherine Price. Admission date, December 8th, 23. The bill was itemized 7 days of care ICU, various procedures. At the bottom, a final notation. Patient deceased, December 15th, 23. She was in the hospital for a week, Ethan said. A week, Lauren. I stared at the dates. My hands were numb. Now look at this. He handed me another document, an official death notification form, the kind that gets sent to next of kin. It was addressed to me at my Seattle address. The date stamp showed it had been mailed on December 22nd, 2023. 7 days after Aunt Mary died. I got this notification on December 28th, I whispered, 10 days after the funeral. Because it was sent a week late, Ethan's voice was tight. Someone delayed it. He handed me the next paper, an email printed out, from Judith Price to St. Patrick Hospital, dated December 8, 2023, the day Aunt Mary was admitted. I read it once, then again because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To whom it may concern, I am writing regarding my sister, Mary Catherine Price, who was admitted to your facility today. I am listed as her emergency contact as she has no immediate family in Montana. I am requesting that all communications regarding her condition go through me exclusively. Please do not contact any other family members until I have had a chance to assess the situation and make appropriate notifications. This is to protect the patient's privacy and to avoid causing unnecessary distress to extended family who live far away. Thank you for your cooperation. Judith Price. Sai done my vision blurred. I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. She told them not to contact you, Ethan said. She made herself the gatekeeper. Keep going, I whispered. He handed me a handwritten letter. The paper was thin, like it had been handled many times. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably personal. Dear Judith, it read, I know we haven't spoken in many years, and I know you have your reasons, but I'm in the hospital now and the doctors say it's serious. I don't know how much time I have. I'm asking you, sister to sister, please let Lauren know I'm here. I need to see her. I need to say goodbye. Whatever anger you have toward me, don't let it keep her away. She deserves the chance to say goodbye. Please, Judith, don't punish her for our mistakes. Let her come. With love, Mary. The date at the top was December 7th, 2023, the day before she was admitted. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. She begged, I said, my voice breaking. She begged Mum to tell me. And Mum never forwarded it, never even mentioned it. Ethan's face was pale. There's more? He showed me another email, this one from the hospital, to my mother dated December 15th at 6:47 p.m. Ms. Price, we regret to inform you that your sister Mary Catherine Price passed away today at 4:32 p.m. Per her wishes, her belongings will be transferred to her attorney. We offer our deepest condolences. If you need support, resources, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then another email. From my mother to the hospital. December 15th at 9:03 p.m. Thank you for the notification. Please proceed with arrangements as outlined in her will. I will notify extended family after the holidays to avoid disrupting their plans. Please delay sending any official notifications until after December 25th. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She'd asked them to wait, to delay telling me until after Christmas, so I wouldn't disrupt the holidays with my grief. There's one more, Ethan said quietly. He handed me a small card, the kind that comes with flowers. It was dated December 16th, 2023, addressed to Judith Price. In loving memory of Mary Catherine Price, private service held December 18th, 23 at Missoula Gardens, as per her wishes, a small gathering of local friends. The funeral had been 3 days after she died. I didn't even know she was gone yet. I looked up at Ethan, tears streaming down my face. She died alone, I whispered. Aunt Mary died asking for me, and I wasn't there because Mum made sure I wouldn't be. Ethan's own eyes were wet. I didn't know Lauren. I swear I didn't know any of this. I don't know what I thought. That you two had just lost touch, that it was natural drift. I didn't know Mum had orchestrated all of it. She kept me from saying goodbye. My voice was hollow. She read that letter where Mary begged her to let me know, and she just didn't. She let her die alone. Not just that. Ethan's voice was shaking now. She delayed the official notification so you wouldn't find out in time for the funeral. She told the hospital to wait until after Christmas because she didn't want your grief to interfere with her holiday plans. I stared at the papers spread across my bed. Evidence of a cruelty so calculated, so deliberate, that it took my breath away. Why would she do this? Ethan asked, and he sounded like a child, lost and confused. Why would she be this cruel? I thought about what my mother had said at dinner, about Aunt Mary calling her a terrible mother, about Mary threatening her perfect image by telling the truth. Because Mary saw her, I said slowly. Really saw her, and Mom couldn't forgive that. Ethan picked up Mary's handwritten letter again, reading it one more time. His hands were trembling. Mom? He whispered to the empty room, to the evidence in his hands, to the reality he was finally seeing. You let her die alone. And that's when everything made sense. After Ethan left my room, I sat there for a long time staring at the documents spread across my bed. Physical evidence of my mother's cruelty. Proof that she'd chosen her pride over my right to say goodbye. I couldn't cry anymore. I'd cried so much in the past hour that I felt hollowed out, empty, just numb shock and a grief so deep I didn't know where to put it. I needed to move, to breathe, to be anywhere but in that room surrounded by those papers. I pulled on my coat and boots and walked outside into the cold morning. Snow had fallen, overnight, fresh and untouched, covering everything in white silence. My breath came out in clouds. The mountains were stark against a pale blue sky. I walked without direction, just following the property line through the trees. The snow crunched under my boots. Everything was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I heard footsteps behind me. "Lauren," my father's voice, tentative, careful. I stopped, but didn't turn around. He came up beside me, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. For a moment we just stood there together, looking out at the white expanse. "Ethan told me," he said finally, "about what he found." I nodded, still not trusting my voice. "I didn't know," Dad said. "I swear to you, I didn't know she'd done that. The hospital records the delayed notification, the letter from Mary. I didn't know about any of it." "Would you have stopped her if you had known?" The question came out harsher than I intended, but I needed to know. Would he have stood up to her, or would he have let it happen the way he'd let so many other things happen? He was quiet for a long time. Too long. "I don't know," he finally admitted, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than a lie. I'd like to think I would have. But your mother? When she makes up her mind about something, it's almost impossible to change it. And I learned a long time ago that fighting her just makes everything harder. "So you just let her make all the decisions, even when they were wrong, even when they hurt people?" "Yes." His voice was heavy with shame. "I did. And I'm sorry, Lauren. I'm so sorry." I finally turned to look at him. He looked older out here in the harsh winter light. Tired, diminished somehow. "Why?" I asked. "Why did she hate me so much that she'd do something like this? She doesn't hate you." "Don't." I held up my hand. "Don't tell me she loves me. Not after this." "She does love you, but she's afraid of you." I stared at him. "Afraid of me?" "Always has been." He started walking again, and I fell into step beside him. "From the time you were little, you were different from Ethan. Quieter, more thoughtful, more creative. You had this way of seeing through people, of understanding things that weren't being said. It made your mother uncomfortable." "I never tried to outshine anyone. I never competed with Ethan." "I know, but that's not what scared her." He stopped and turned to me. "Your mother built her entire life on control, on managing how things looked, how people perceived us. She needed everyone to fit into the roles she'd assigned them. And you never quite fit. You asked questions she didn't want to answer. You had opinions she didn't like. You wanted things she didn't understand." "Like what?" "Like being an art teacher instead of something more prestigious. Like caring more about meaning than money. Like choosing your own path instead of the one she'd planned for you." He smiled sadly. "You were becoming your own person, and she couldn't control that, so she tried to diminish it. Tried to make you smaller, to convince you that who you naturally were wasn't good enough." I thought about all those Christmases at the corner of the table. All those generic gifts. All those times my accomplishments were met with faint praise while Ethan's were celebrated. "And Aunt Mary saw all of that," I said slowly. "Mary saw everything. She tried to talk to your mother about it, tried to make her see what she was doing to you, but Judith couldn't hear it. To her, Mary's criticism was a betrayal, an attack, so she cut her out. And kept me from her. Yes, because Mary loved you in a way Judith never learned how to, unconditionally, without needing you to be anything other than yourself. And I think that terrified your mother. She was afraid that if you spent time with Mary, you'd realize how different love could be, that you'd choose Mary over her." Tears were freezing on my cheeks. "I never wanted to choose. I never wanted to win. I just wanted to belong. And Dad's face crumpled. I know, sweetheart, and you should have. You should have belonged without question. That's on us. That's on me for not standing up for you. We stood there in the snow, two people who'd failed each other in different ways, trying to figure out if there was anything left to salvage. I have something to tell you, he said after a while. Something I've never told anyone. I waited. I used to write to Mary, for years. After your mother cut her off, I found her address and started sending letters. Photos of you, updates about your life. I knew your mother would be furious if she found out, so I kept it secret. But I couldn't let Mary disappear completely. She was my sister-in-law and she loved you, and it seemed wrong to let that just end. I remembered the letters Ethan and I had found from Aunt Mary's lawyer, the correspondence between Dad and Mary. She kept them all, I said. Your letters. I found them after she died. Did you? He looked relieved, sad. I'm glad. I wanted her to know that someone still cared, that you hadn't forgotten her even if you didn't know you were remembering. Why didn't you tell me you were writing to her? Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of your mother's anger. Because I chose the path of least resistance instead of doing what was right. He looked at me directly. I failed you, Lauren, and I failed Mary, and I don't know how to fix that. I didn't know either. But standing there looking at my father's grief-stricken face, I realised something. He wasn't the villain of this story. He was just weak, and weakness, while painful, wasn't the same as malice. You can't fix it, I said finally, but you can stop pretending it didn't happen. We turned and started walking back toward the house. It was visible now through the trees, warm and lit smoke rising from the chimney. A symbol of everything Aunt Mary had built, everything she'd left me, everything my mother had tried to keep me from having. That's a beautiful home, Dad said quietly. It is. Mary would be proud of what you've done with it. I hope so. We were almost back to the house when he stopped one more time. Your mother's going to fight this, he said. What Ethan found, what you know now, she's not going to accept it easily. She's going to try to explain it away to make it seem reasonable somehow. She's going to defend herself. I know. Are you ready for that? I thought about the documents in my room, about the letter Mary wrote begging to see me, about the deliberate cruelty of delaying notification until after the funeral. I don't have to be ready, I said. I just have to be honest. We walked inside together, stomping snow off our boots in the mudroom. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel it before I saw her. My mother was standing in the living room, her arms crossed, her face pale but composed. She had rebuilt her armour overnight, put her walls back up. She looked at me with that familiar expression of controlled displeasure, but Judith wasn't ready to surrender. My mother stood in the living room for exactly 30 seconds after my father and I came in from the snow, long enough to look at both of us with an expression I couldn't quite rid anger, certainly, but something else underneath. Fear, maybe, or calculation. Then she turned and walked upstairs without a word. We heard her bedroom door close. Lock. Give her time, my father said quietly. She needs to process all of this. But I knew my mother better than that. She didn't process. She strategized. An hour later, I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone started buzzing. A text from Margaret, who'd left the ranch yesterday, but was apparently still following the ongoing saga online. Lauren, is your mum okay? She just posted something weird on Facebook. My stomach tightened. I opened Facebook and navigated to my mother's profile. There it was, posted 12 minutes ago. Already accumulating likes and comments from her circle of friends. Some people receive unexpected blessings and forget the family that raised them. Money changes people. It's sad to watch someone you love become someone you don't recognize. But I suppose we all make our choices. Some of us choose loyalty, others choose show. No names mentioned, no direct references. But anyone who'd seen my Instagram post would know exactly what she was talking about. The comments were already rolling in. "Oh, Judith, I'm so sorry you're going through this. Family can be so difficult. Sending prayers. Some people just don't appreciate what they have until it's gone." I set my phone down, my hand shaking. Of course she would do this. She couldn't win the argument in person, so she was taking it public, reframing the narrative, making herself the victim, and me, the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on family. "What is it?" Dad asked, seeing my face. I showed him the post. He closed his eyes. "Judith," he sighed, "what are you doing?" But I knew what she was doing. She was fighting back the only way she knew how. Through image management, through controlling what people thought, through painting herself as the wounded party and me as the villain. And for her friends in Ohio, it might work. They only knew her version of our family. The carefully curated version she'd spent decades constructing. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd posted it publicly, which meant people beyond her immediate circle could see it, could comment. My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from Elena Rodriguez, who ran the feed store in town. I'd met her during the renovations, and she'd been incredibly helpful, connecting me with local contractors. "Saw your mum's post. Want me to set the record straight?" Before I could respond, I saw that Elena had already commented on my mother's Facebook post. "Hi there, I'm a neighbour of Lauren's in Montana. Just wanted to offer a different perspective. Lauren helped our community tremendously over the past year. When the Miller family lost their home in a fire, she organised housing and donations. When our local school needed art supplies, she funded the entire programme. She's been nothing but generous and kind. Maybe money doesn't change people, maybe it just reveals who they always were." I stared at the comment. I'd helped the Millers because it was the right thing to do. I donated to the school because I knew what it meant to have a teacher who believed in you. I hadn't done any of it for recognition. But Elena remembered. And, apparently, she wasn't the only one. Another comment appeared, this one from Tom Brennan, who owned the hardware store. "I don't know what family situation you're dealing with, Mom, but your daughter has been a blessing to this town. She hired local workers for her renovations, when she could have brought in cheaper labour from elsewhere. She tips the waitresses at the diner 50%. She shows up when neighbours need help. That's the Lauren we know." Then another, from Sarah Chen, the postal worker. "Lauren always asks about my kids, remembers their names, sends Christmas cards to half the town. I don't know what happened between you two, but the person you're describing doesn't match the person we know." I watched in real time as my mother's attempt to control the narrative unravelled. More comments poured in, not from her friends, but from my neighbours, people who'd seen how I actually lived, not just the image I projected. "Maybe some people were changed by kindness, not to money," wrote Marcus Webb, who ran the local diner. My father was reading over my shoulder. "Well," he said quietly, "that's not what she expected. My mother's friends tried to defend her. You people don't know the full story. Family is complicated. Maybe show some respect." But the Montana community wasn't backing down. They knew me. They'd watched me become part of their town, and they were protecting one of their own. My phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, and again. Finally, I answered. "Take it down." Her voice was shaking. "Tell them to take their comments down." "I didn't tell them to post anything, Mom. They did that on their own. This is humiliating. These strangers are attacking me on my own page." "They're not attacking you, they're defending me. There's a difference." "Lauren, please, this is getting out of control. Just tell them to stop." I can't control what other people say, just like you couldn't control what people thought when they saw my Christmas photos. That's different. "How?" Silence. "Delete your post," or what I said. "If you don't want people commenting on it, delete it." "I'm not deleting it. I have every right to express my feelings." "Then I guess you'll have to accept that other people have the same right." She hung up. I looked at the Facebook thread again. It had grown. Not just Montana locals now, but friends from my teaching days, former students, people I'd known over the years who were seeing the post and deciding to speak up. Ms. Price helped me pass art class when I was failing everything else. She stayed after school every day to tutor me for free. She saw something in me when no one else did. She's one of the best people I know. Lauren painted a mural at our community centre for free, spent her whole summer on it. This description of her doesn't match reality. One comment in particular stood out. It was from Jamie, my cousin. "Hi, Aunt Judith. It's Jamie. Remember me, the niece. You stopped inviting to family events after I came out. Lauren invited me to her Christmas celebration. She made me feel like I belonged for the first time in years. Maybe, instead of posting vague accusations on Facebook, you could ask yourself why your daughter needed to build a new family in the first place." I closed my eyes. Jamie hadn't held back. The thread continued growing. My mother's post, intended to shame me, had become a referendum on her own behaviour. People were sharing stories of times she'd been cold to them, dismissive, judgmental. Old wounds were opening, old grievances were surfacing. This was spinning beyond anyone's control now. My father's phone rang. He looked at the screen's side and answered, "Hello, Judith." I could hear her voice through the phone, high and panicked. Dad listened for a moment, then said, "I can't make them delete their comments. And honestly, Judith, maybe you should read what they're saying. Really read it." He hung up gently. "She's upset," he said unnecessarily. "I didn't want this." I felt sick. I didn't want a public pile-on. I just wanted to have Christmas with people who cared about me. "I know, but you can't control how people react when the truth comes out. You opened a door. Other people walked through it." Upstairs, I heard my mother's door open. Footsteps in the hallway. Then, Ethan's voice muffled, but clearly agitated. My phone buzzed with a new notification. My mother had deleted her post. But screenshots were already circulating. People were sharing it on other platforms, discussing it in community groups. The damage was done. Margaret texted again. "Your mum's post is making the rounds. People are talking. This is bigger than just your family now." I sat down heavily on the couch. This wasn't what I'd wanted. I'd wanted acknowledgement, understanding, maybe even reconciliation. But instead, I triggered something I couldn't control. A public reckoning that was humiliating my mother, validating me in ways that felt hollow and exposing our family dysfunction to strangers. "I should never have posted those photos," I said quietly. "No," Dad said firmly. "You had every right to share your life. What's happening now isn't your fault. It's the natural consequence of years of behaviour your mother thought she could hide." But it didn't feel like natural consequences. It felt like a wildfire I'd accidentally started and couldn't put out. Upstairs doors were slamming. Voices were raised. Ethan and my mother were arguing about something. I pulled out my phone and started typing a new post. Something to calm the situation, to ask people to stop. But before I could finish, my phone rang again. A Montana number I didn't recognise. "Hello. Ms. Price, this is David Harrison, Ethan's former client. I think we need to talk." My blood ran cold. The storm wasn't over yet. "Ms. Price." David Harrison's voice was calm, professional. "I apologise for calling out of the blue. I got your number from your brother. I hope that's all right." My heart was racing. "It's fine. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to reach out after pulling my business from your brother. I feel I owe you an explanation since my decision seems to have caused some family tension." "Mr. Harrison, you don't owe me." "Please, let me finish. My wife and I saw your Christmas photos. She recognised some people in them, and we started asking questions. What we learned about your family situation troubled us. But more than that, we were impressed by what you'd built. The way you included people who'd been excluded. the way the community spoke about you. I didn't know what to say. I didn't pull my business from your brother because of scandal misprice. I pulled it because of character. And I wanted you to know that. What you did took courage. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding the phone, trying to process what he'd just said. He'd pulled the deal not because of embarrassment, but because he'd judged Ethan's character and found it lacking. That somehow felt worse. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Ethan appeared, his face red, his phone clutched in his hand like a weapon. "What did Harrison say to you?" he demanded. Did you call him? Did you tell him your sob story to make sure he wouldn't work with me?" "What? No, he called me." "To say what?" I looked at my father, who was standing in the doorway, then back at Ethan. He said he pulled the deal because of character concerns, not scandal, character. Ethan's laugh was bitter and sharp. Of course, that's what he told you. You're the hero of this story, right? Poor Lauren finally standing up for herself. Never mind who gets hurt in the process. I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan. But you did. You posted those photos knowing people would see them, knowing they'd ask questions. You wanted everyone to think we're terrible people, and it worked. Congratulations. I hope you're happy with yourself. I'm not happy about any of this. Then why did you do it? His voice cracked. Why couldn't you just have Christmas somewhere else quietly? Why did it have to be this big production, with photos and captions designed to make us look bad? I didn't design anything to make you look bad. I shared a moment with people who mattered to me, with a caption that said, "Family is who shows up." Don't pretend that wasn't a dig at us. It was the truth. It was manipulation. You manipulated the narrative to make yourself look like the victim and us look like villains. And now I'm paying the price for it. He was pacing now, his movements jerky and agitated. Do you know what this deal meant to me? Do you have any idea? I know it was important. It was everything. It was my reputation, my future, the foundation for my entire career. And you destroyed it with one Instagram post and your self-righteous little army of defenders. They defended themselves, I said quietly. I didn't ask them to. You didn't have to ask. You set it up perfectly. Poor Lauren abandoned by her family. Poor Lauren building a new life with the rejects and outcasts. You made yourself the hero and us the villains, and people bought it because you're good at playing the victim. That's not fair. Fair. He spun to face me. You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that Mom's being attacked online by strangers? Is it fair that I lost the biggest deal of my career? Is it fair that our entire family is being publicly humiliated because you couldn't handle not being invited to one Christmas? It wasn't one Christmas. My voice was rising now, despite my efforts to stay calm. It was a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter, of being pushed aside, of watching you get everything while I got nothing. You got plenty. You just wanted more. I wanted to be seen. There's a difference. You were seen. You just didn't like what you saw reflected back. So you created this fantasy where you're the wronged party and we're the monsters. Well, guess what real life has consequences, and you just ruined mine. We stood there staring at each other across the living room. My father looked like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. I didn't ruin anything, I said finally. I just stopped pretending. Ethan's face went pale, then red. He opened his mouth, closing it, then grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. Where are you going? Dad asked. Out? Anywhere but here. He yanked the door open, letting in a blast of cold air. I can't even look at her right now. He slammed the door behind him. Through the window, I watched him get into the rental car and speed down the driveway, snow spraying behind the tyres. My father sighed heavily. He'll cool off. But upstairs, another door opened. Sarah, Ethan's fiancée, who'd been quiet through all of this, appeared at the top of the stairs. "Lauren," she said hesitantly, "can we talk?" I looked up at her, this woman I barely knew, who'd been dragged into our family chaos through no fault of her own. "Of course." She came down slowly, hugging her arms around herself. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay." "Is it true, what Ethan said about your family? About how they treated you?" I glanced at my father. He gave a small nod. "Yes," I said. "It's true." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I thought so. I've been watching him this trip, watching how he talks to you, how your mother talks to you, and I keep thinking..." She stopped wiping her eyes. "If this is how he treats his sister, how will he treat me when things get hard?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "Sarah," Dad started. "I'm not saying he's a bad person," she continued, "but he's so angry, and he doesn't seem to think he's done anything wrong. He just keeps saying you ruined things, that you're bitter and jealous, but I don't think that's the whole story." "It's not," I said quietly. She nodded like I'd confirmed something she already knew. "I need to think about everything, about whether I can marry into a family that..." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. That's not fair to you." "It's okay." "No, it's not. This is your family, and I shouldn't..." She shook her head. "I just need some time to think." She went back upstairs, leaving Dad and me alone again. "She's going to leave him," I said. "Maybe, maybe not. Because of me. Because I posted those photos and started this whole thing." "No," Dad said firmly. "Because of who we are. Who we've always been. You didn't create this situation, Lauren. You just stopped hiding it." But it didn't feel like truth. It felt like destruction. He left, but not for long. I sat on the couch staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Sarah questioning her engagement, Ethan losing a major deal, my mother's public humiliation, Dad standing helplessly by, unable to fix any of it. This wasn't what I'd wanted. None of it. My phone buzzed. I almost didn't look. I'd had enough notifications, enough messages, enough digital chaos for a lifetime. But the subject line caught my eye. RE Montana Property Inquiry betrayal. Price Estate. The sender was listed as Coldwell, Banker, Real Estate Missoula Office. I opened it. "Dear Ms. Price, we apologise for the delay in reaching out. We've been attempting to contact you since January 2024 regarding a property inquiry. Your brother, Ethan Price, contacted our office in early January, shortly after Mary Price's passing was announced in the Missoulian newspaper. He indicated he had inside knowledge about the estate and suggested we prepare an offer before probate closed. He provided property details, approximate acreage, and appraisal estimates. We attempted to follow up with you directly at the email address he provided, but our messages bounced back. After seeing recent social media posts about your Montana property, we wanted to reach out through public records. If you're interested in discussing the property's market value or potential listing, please don't hesitate to contact us. Best regards, Michael Chen, Senior Agent." I read it 3 times. Ethan had contacted a real estate company in January, right after Aunt Mary died, before I'd even received the official notification, before probate had closed, before anyone except the lawyer and my mother knew about the inheritance. He'd tried to sell information about the ranch. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. "Lauren?" Dad noticed my face. "What is it?" I couldn't speak, just handed him the phone. He read it, his expression darkening with each line. "Oh, Ethan, what did you do?" "He knew," I whispered. "He knew about Aunt Mary's death before I did. He knew about the ranch, and instead of telling me he contacted a realtor to try to make money off of it. Dad sank into the chair across from me. There has to be an explanation. What explanation could possibly justify this? Maybe he was just exploring options. Maybe he thought he was helping. Helping? My voice rose. Dad, he tried to broker a deal on property that wasn't his, that he knew wasn't his. He provided inside information to a real estate company while I was being kept in the dark about Aunt Mary's death. The timeline was becoming horrifyingly clear. Mum had delayed telling me. The hospital had been instructed not to contact me. And while I was being kept away, while Mary was dying alone, Ethan was calculating property values and potential commissions. I grabbed my phone and called him. It rang 4 times before he answered. What? His voice was still angry raw. I just got an email from Coldwell Banker. Silence. They say you contacted them in January, about Aunt Mary's ranch, the month she died. More silence. Ethan, did you try to sell information about the property? I was exploring options. Options, she wasn't even buried yet. The property was going to be sold eventually. I was just getting ahead of sure. How did you even know about it? My voice was shaking. I didn't know. The lawyer took weeks to find me. But somehow you knew, and you were already talking to realtors. I heard him take a breath. The obituary was in the Montana paper. I Google myself sometimes for business purposes, and our last name came up. I saw that Mary Price had died, and I put 2 and 2 together. And your first thought was money. My first thought was reality. That property was worth millions. Someone was going to inherit it. I figured it would get tied up in probate, go to some distant relative, and eventually end up on the market. I was positioning myself to potentially represent the sale. You were positioning yourself to profit from Aunt Mary's death. It's not like that. Then, what is it like, Ethan? Explain it to me. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you found out our aunt died and immediately started calculating your commission. It's business, Lauren. That's how the world works. No, my voice was hard now. That's how you work. You saw an opportunity and you took it. You didn't think about family. You didn't think about the person who died. You thought about profit. I thought I deserved it more than whoever would end up with it. His voice rose. I thought when I realised Mary had property that valuable, I assumed it would go to some charity or be divided among distant relatives. I figured I could at least make something from it. I'm a real estate broker. That's literally my job. You thought you deserved it. Yes, you were just a teacher, Lauren. You weren't going to do anything meaningful with a property like that. I could have turned it into something, a development, an investment, something that actually created value. The words hung between us like poison. You knew it was coming to me, I said slowly. That's why you never told me she was sick. You wanted me out of the picture. I didn't. He stopped. You knew. Mum knew. And you both kept it from me so you could what? Hope she'd change her will. Hope I'd be too late to contest anything. Hope you could swoop in and broker a deal before I even knew what was happening. I didn't know you were inheriting. I swear I thought it was going elsewhere. When I found out you got everything, I was shocked. But not shocked enough to stop you from being angry about it. Not shocked enough to be happy for me. You were angry because you'd already started counting money that wasn't yours. That's not fair. Did you tell Mum? I asked. Did you tell her you'd contacted realtors? Did you two plan this together? No, Mum didn't know about the real estate inquiry. I did that on my own. But she knew Mary was dying, and she kept us both away. Ethan was quiet. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. You wanted me out of the picture, I said again. Not because you knew I was inheriting, but because you hoped I wasn't. You hoped you'd get a chance to profit from Mary's death, and my presence would complicate that. I didn't think of it like that. Then, how did you think of it? I thought His voice cracked. I thought I'd finally have something that proved I was worth more than everyone else. Something big, something impressive. I thought if I could broker a multi-million-dollar estate sale, people would finally see that I'd made it, that I was successful, that I mattered. You already mattered, Ethan. At least to them. You were always the golden child, always the one who got everything, and it still wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. So you tried to take the one thing that was mine. The silence that followed was his confession. I hung up and sat there with the phone in my lap, feeling like something fundamental had broken inside me. My mother had kept me from saying goodbye. My brother had tried to profit from Aunt Mary's death. My entire family had failed me in ways I was still discovering. Dad was sitting across from me, his face grey. "Lauren, I'm so sorry." "Did you know?" I asked, my voice hollow. "About Ethan contacting the realtors?" "No, I swear I didn't know." "But you knew about Mum keeping me away from Mary." "Not at the time. I found out later when I saw the hospital notifications. But by then, it was too late. I should have said something. I should have confronted her." "Why didn't you?" He looked down at his hands. "Because I'm a coward. Because it's always been easier to look away than to fight her. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." We sat in silence. Outside, the late afternoon sun was turning the snow golden. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it just felt cold. There was a knock at the door. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to face anyone else or hear any more revelations. But Dad stood and opened it. A delivery driver stood there with a FedEx envelope. "Package for Lauren Price." "That's me," I said, standing. He handed it over. I signed for it and he left. The return address was Thomas Brennan, Attorney at Law, Missoula, Montana. "Mary's lawyer," I said to Dad. "Maybe more estate paperwork." I opened it carefully. Inside was a thick manila envelope and a handwritten note on law firm letterhead. "Dear Lauren, I apologise for the delay in sending this. Among Mary's effects, I found a box marked for Lauren after everything is settled. Inside were letters I believe you should see. These were kept separately from the official estate documents per Mary's wishes. With sympathy, Thomas Brennan." My hands were shaking as I opened the manila envelope. Letters, dozens of them, bound with ribbon, organised by year spanning 2 decades. The handwriting on the envelopes alternated, some in Aunt Mary's careful script, others in handwriting I recognised immediately, my father's. I looked up at him. He'd gone very pale. "Dad, I can explain," he said quietly. I pulled out the first letter. It was from Mary, dated 22 years ago, shortly after she'd been cut off from our family. "Dear Robert, I miss her already. Please tell me how she's doing. Tell me about school, her friends, her art. I need to know she's okay, even if I can't see her. Your sister-in-law, Mary." The response was in Dad's handwriting. "Dear Mary Lauren is struggling. She doesn't understand why you're gone. Judith won't talk about it, and I don't know what to tell her. She asks about you constantly. She misses you. Robert." I sat down slowly, holding the letters like they might disintegrate. "You wrote to her," I whispered, "all those years." I couldn't let her disappear completely. Dad said, his voice thick. "After Judith cut her off, I found Mary's address through old Christmas cards. I started writing. Just updates. Things about your life. I thought Mary deserved to know you were okay." I pulled out another letter. This one from Mary, dated 10 years ago. "Robert, thank you for the photos. She looks just like you. I see your gentleness in her face. Please keep sending them. They're all I have of her, Mary." And Dad's response: "She got accepted to the teaching program. She's so happy. I wish Judith could see how proud I am of her, but she only talks about Ethan's accomplishments. I can't protect Lauren from Judith's coldness, but at least she'll have you in spirit. I make sure she knows she's loved, even if I don't say it often enough. Robert." Tears were streaming down my face. I pulled out more letters, reading them in quick succession. Lauren got her first teaching job. She called me crying with joy. Judith said it was a waste of her degree. Lauren's getting married. I'm not sure he's right for her, but she seems happy. Mary, I wish you could be at the wedding. The marriage is falling apart. Lauren sounds so sad on the phone. I don't know how to help her. Lauren got divorced. Judith told her not to come home for Christmas with her sadness. Mary, I failed her. I didn't stand up for her. I let Judith shut her out, and I'll never forgive myself. Mary, I'm scared. Lauren is so isolated, so lonely. I send her money sometimes anonymously. I call when Judith isn't home, but it's not enough. It's never been enough. My father had been documenting my entire adult life for Aunt Mary, keeping her connected to me even though we'd been kept apart. The final letter was from Mary, dated just 3 months before she died. Robert, I've made my decision. I'm leaving everything to Lauren, not because of the money, but because she deserves to know she mattered to someone, that she was loved unconditionally. She'll need proof of that. Will you make sure she knows? Will you tell her I never stopped thinking about her? Please don't let Judith take this from her too. With love, Mary. Dad's response was short, written in a shaky hand. I promise. She'll know. Thank you for loving her when I didn't know how. Robert. I looked up at him through my tears. He was crying too silently, his shoulders shaking. You saved me, I said, my voice breaking. All those years. You were there. You never said anything, but you were there. I should have done more. I should have stood up to your mother. You did what you could. I stood and crossed to him, wrapping my arms around him. He held me tight and we both cried. You kept me connected to Mary. You made sure I wasn't completely alone. That mattered, Dad. It mattered so much. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. You were strong enough. In your own way. We stood there in the golden afternoon light, holding each other, crying for all the lost years, all the missed opportunities, all the ways our family had fractured. She knew, I said finally. Mary knew everything about my life because of you. I needed her to know. I needed someone to witness that you mattered, that you were worthy of love. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for not letting me disappear completely. He held me tighter. We stayed like that until the sun started to set, until the room grew dim, until we'd both cried ourselves empty. Then I gathered the letters carefully, reverently, and looked at my father. There's still one person we haven't heard from, I said. Your mother. She's been upstairs all day, silent, probably hoping this will all blow over. Dad nodded. She's going to have to face this eventually. She owes me the truth, the real truth, about why she cut Mary off, about why she was so threatened by her, about what really happened 20 years ago. Are you ready to hear it? I don't know, but I need to. Dad stood straightening his shoulders. Then let's go talk to her. But there was one more truth left to uncover. We climbed the stairs together, Dad and I, the letters still in my hands. When we reached my mother's door, I knocked, firm but not angry. No response. Judith, Dad tried. We need to talk. Nothing. He opened the door slowly. The room was empty, the bed was made, her suitcase was still there, but she wasn't. Where did she go? I asked. We searched the house, living room, kitchen, guest rooms. She wasn't inside. Then I saw her through the window. She was sitting in the snow next to Aunt Mary's rose garden. No coat, no hat, just sitting there in her thin sweater, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the dormant bushes. Jesus, Dad breathed. She'll freeze out there. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and went outside. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. My mother didn't look up as I approached. She just kept staring at the garden. Mum? She didn't respond. I draped the blanket over her shoulders. She pulled it tight, but still didn't look at me. You'll get hypothermia out here, I said. Maybe that would be easier. I sat down beside her in the snow. It was wet and cold, soaking through my jeans immediately. We sat there in silence, looking at the garden where nothing grew. Mary planted this, Mum finally said. Did you know that the neighbours told me? She loved roses. When we were girls, we used to pick them from our grandmother's garden. We'd put them in our hair and pretend we were princesses. Her voice was distant, hollow. That was before. Before what? She was quiet for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, before our mother left us. I turned to look at her. Her face was bare, no makeup, her skin blotchy and raw from crying. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, and smaller somehow. I was 7, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Mary was 12. Our mother took us to a building in Cleveland. She said we were visiting someone, but when we got inside, she talked to a woman at a desk, signed some papers. Then she kissed us both on the forehead and said, "Be good." My chest tightened. We waited by the window for 3 days. Mary kept telling me Mum was coming back, that there was some mistake, that she'd never leave us. Mum's voice cracked, but she never came. The orphanage said she'd signed away her parental rights, that we were wards of the state now. Mum, I'm so sorry. Mary took care of me. She was only 12, but she made sure I ate, made sure I did my homework, made sure I didn't give up. She wiped at her face with trembling hands. We were there for 8 years, until Mary turned 18 and got us out. She worked 3 jobs to rent us a tiny apartment. She raised me. She was my mother when our real mother abandoned us. I sat there trying to reconcile this story with the woman who'd cut her sister out of her life. Then why? Because she saw me, Mum said, her voice breaking. She saw who I'd become. When I met your father, when I started building this perfect life, Mary tried to tell me I was doing it wrong. She said I was so focused on appearances that I'd forgotten how to be real, that I was becoming cold, that I was going to hurt people I loved by trying to control everything. And you couldn't hear it? No, because if Mary was right then, I'd failed. After everything we'd been through, after everything she'd sacrificed for me, I was supposed to be better. I was supposed to prove that we were worth keeping, that we were good enough, that we deserved to be loved. She looked at me finally, her eyes red and broken. But I couldn't do it without being perfect, without controlling every detail, without making sure no one could see the scared 7-year-old who got left at an orphanage. So you cut her off rather than let her see you were struggling. I cut her off because she was right, and I couldn't face that. She pulled the blanket tighter. And then you came along, and you were so much like her, sensitive, perceptive. You saw through people, you saw through me, and I was terrified that if you spent time with Mary, you'd realise I was broken, that you'd choose her over me, that I'd be abandoned again. I never would have, but I thought you would. So I pushed you away before you could leave. I made you small so you wouldn't outgrow me. I criticised you so you'd need me. I kept you from Mary so you wouldn't have anyone to compare me to. She was crying openly now. And I didn't realise until it was too late that I'd done exactly what I was afraid of. I'd driven you away by trying to hold on too tight. I felt tears on my own face. You hurt me, Mom. For years, you made me feel like I wasn't enough. I know. You kept me from Mary when she was dying. I know. You let her die alone because you were too proud to admit you were wrong. I know. She turned to me, her face devastated. I know what I did, and I can't take it back. I can't fix it. Mary's gone, and I never got to tell her she was right. That I'm sorry. That I loved her, even when I was too broken to show it. We sat there in the snow, 2 women, shaped by abandonment in different ways, trying to figure out if there was any path forward. When I had you, Mum said quietly, I swore you'd have everything. A stable home, a perfect life, everything I didn't have. But I gave you everything except what I never had myself. What's that? Love without conditions, love that doesn't require perfection, love that stays even when things get messy. She looked at me. I don't know how to do that. I never learned, but I want to try, if you'll let me. I thought about all the years of hurt, all the moments of rejection, all the times I'd reached out only to be pushed away. But I also thought about the 7-year-old girl waiting by a window, the scared woman who built walls so high she forgot how to get out. You don't have to be perfect anymore, Mum, I said softly. You just have to be here, really here. No more walls, no more pretending, just honest. I don't know if I know how to do that. Then learn. We'll both learn. She looked at me for a long moment. Then slowly, hesitantly, she leaned against my shoulder. I put my arm around her and we sat there in the cold crying together for all the lost years, all the missed out chances, all the ways fear had twisted love into something unrecognisable. I'm sorry, she whispered, for all of it. I'm so sorry. I know. We stayed there until Dad came out and insisted we come inside before we both got sick. He helped Mum up and we walked back to the house together, a fragile, broken family trying to figure out if we could rebuild. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. That's what I kept telling myself over the year that followed. The months after that devastating Christmas were hard, painful, full of uncomfortable conversations and setbacks and moments when I wondered if any of us could actually change. My mother started therapy. Real therapy, not just reading self-help books. She called me every week and sometimes we'd talk for 5 minutes before one of us got too overwhelmed. Other times we'd talk for an hour. Slowly, painstakingly, we started learning how to communicate without the walls between us. Ethan lost Sarah for a while. She'd gone home after that trip telling him she needed space to think. They did couples counselling. He started his own therapy too, so 6 months later they got back together, but different, more honest. Dad and I grew closer. He'd fly out to Montana every few months and we'd spend weekends together working on the ranch. He didn't say much, but he was present, really present, and that was enough. Now, December 2025. I stood in the ranch kitchen, preparing for Christmas again. But this time was different. This time, everyone was invited. Aunt Carol arrived first, as she had the year before, but this time she brought her boyfriend, a kind man named Steve, who worked at the same grocery store. Margaret and Mrs. Kim came together, having become close friends over the past year. The Hartleys drove up from Ohio. Jamie and her girlfriend flew in from Denver, and then, nervously, tentatively, my parents and Ethan arrived. Mum stood in the doorway, taking in the house that had been decorated almost identically to last year. She looked at me, and I saw fear in her eyes. Fear that she didn't belong here. Fear that I'd invited her out of obligation rather than genuine desire. "Come in, Mom," I said. "You're welcome here." She nodded, not quite able to speak. Ethan was different too, quieter, less confident. He'd brought Sarah, who was showing now 5 months pregnant. They'd gotten married in a small ceremony in the fall and I'd flown out for it. It had been awkward but genuine. "Thank you for having us," Ethan said, and he meant it. The first hour was tense. The two groups, my chosen family and my blood family, circled each other carefully. Aunt Carol and my mother had a stilted conversation about the weather. Jamie kept her distance from Judith, not quite ready to let old wounds heal completely. But then Dad started helping Tom Hartley build the fire and they fell into easy conversation about woodworking. Margaret and Sarah discovered they both loved the same podcast and started comparing notes. Mrs. Kim showed my mother how to arrange the centerpiece flowers, and Mum actually listened, taking direction instead of giving it. Ethan found me in the kitchen, where I was making Aunt Mary's stuffed peppers again. "Can I help?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment, then handed him a knife. "Dice the onions." We worked in silence for a few minutes. Then he said quietly, "I wrote a letter to Aunt Mary. I know she's gone, but my therapist said it might help, to say the things I never got to say." "What did you write?" "That I'm sorry, that I was greedy and selfish, that I wish I'd known her, that I'm trying to be better." He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "And that I'm grateful she gave you this place. That even though I tried to profit from it, she saw the truth. She knew you'd use it to bring people together instead of pushing them apart." "She would have liked you," I said, "if you'd let her know you." "I know. I missed out on a lot because I was too busy chasing the wrong things." By dinner time, the barriers had dissolved. The table was crowded 17 people again, but a different 17. My mother sat between Aunt Carol and Mrs. Kim, actually engaging in real conversation instead of polite performance. Dad was telling stories about his childhood that I'd never heard before. Ethan was laughing at something Dennis said, his arm around Sarah. And I sat at the head of the table looking around at these people, broken, complicated, imperfect people who were trying. After dinner, as people were clearing plates and brewing coffee, Sarah stood up and clinked her glass gently. "I know this is Lauren's celebration," she said, "but Ethan and I have some news we wanted to share with everyone here." Ethan stood beside her, his hand on her back. "We're having a go," Sarah said, smiling. "And we wanted to ask Lauren something." Everyone went quiet. "We'd like to name her Mary," Ethan said, looking at me. "If that's okay with you, to honour the woman who brought this family back together even after she was gone." My throat closed up. I couldn't speak, just nodded. Mum was crying, Dad was beaming. The whole room erupted in congratulations and joy. Later, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered mountains. The same view Aunt Mary must have looked at every day. I felt complete for the first time in my life. Not because everything was perfect, not because all wounds were healed, but because we were trying. Because we'd chosen honesty over performance. Because we'd built something real from the broken pieces. I thought about how far we'd come in 1 year, how much further we still had to go. Behind me I heard footsteps. Daniel, the veterinarian I'd been seeing for the past 8 months, came up beside me. "Beautiful night," he said. "It is." He took my hand. "You did this, you know. You created this." "Aunt Mary created it." I just continued what she started. "No, Mary gave you the place, but you gave it meaning." I leaned against him, feeling grateful and tired and hopeful all at once. And yet there was one more surprise. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "Come outside with me for a minute, I want to show you something." "It's freezing out there." "Just for a minute. I promise it'll be worth it." I grabbed my coat and followed him onto the back porch. The Christmas lights I'd strung along the railing glowed warm against the darkness reflecting off the fresh snow. The sky was clear stars scattered across it like diamonds. "What did you want to show me?" I asked. "This." He gestured at the view. "I wanted you to see your home the way I see it, the way everyone who loves you sees it." I looked at the ranch, at the warm lights in the windows, at the smoke curling from the chimney. I could hear laughter from inside, see shadows moving past the windows. "It's beautiful," I said. "It is, but that's not what I'm talking about." He turned to face me, taking both my hands. "Lauren, when I met you a year ago, you were in the middle of the hardest time of your life. Your family was fractured. You were questioning everything. And yet you still showed up. You still did the work. You still chose love over bitterness. Daniel, let me finish." He smiled. "I've watched you rebuild relationships that most people would have walked away from. I've seen you forgive people who didn't deserve it. I've watched you turn this place into a sanctuary, not just for yourself, but for everyone who needed to feel like they belonged. My heart was starting to pound, and somewhere along the way, I fell completely in love with you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I know this is fast. I know we've only been together 8 months. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with someone who builds instead of destroys, who chooses grace over grudges, who makes people feel seen. He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring with a small diamond, beautiful in its unpretentiousness. Lauren Price, will you marry me? I stared at the ring at this kind man standing in front of me at the life he was offering. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Yes, I finally whispered. Yes. He slipped the ring onto my finger and then he kissed me, and the world felt right in a way it never had before. When we palmwood apart, I realised we had an audience. Through the window, I could see faces pressed against the glass. They'd been watching. The door burst open, and suddenly everyone was pouring onto the porch despite the cold. Margaret was crying. Jamie was cheering. Aunt Carol was hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. And then my mother was there. She pushed through the crowd gently, and for a moment we just looked at each other. Then she pulled me into a hug, really holding me for the first time in longer than I could remember. You deserve all the happiness, sweetheart, she whispered in my ear, all of it. I'm so happy for you. When she pulled back, there were tears on her face. Real tears. Not the controlled, calculated tears she'd cried at family events for show. These were genuine. Thank you, Mum. Thank you for not giving up on me. Dad was next, shaking Daniel's hand and then hugging me. He's a good man, he said. Mary would have loved him. I think so too. Ethan and Sarah came over Sarah glowing despite her exhaustion from the pregnancy. Congratulations, Ethan said. I mean it. I'm really happy for you, Lauren. And I believed him. We all crowded back inside the cold, forgotten in the excitement. Someone opened champagne. Someone else started playing music. The celebration that had started at dinner continued into the night, but now with this new joy layered on top. I stood in the middle of the living room, Daniel's arm around me, my ring catching the light from the Christmas tree. I looked around at all these faces, my mother arranging dessert plates with Mrs. Kim, my father showing Ethan how to adjust the fire, Aunt Carol dancing with Steve, Margaret and Jamie laughing about something. I finally have a family that feels real. I said not to anyone in particular, just to the universe. Daniel kissed my temple. You always had this family. You just had to build the table big enough to fit everyone. The party continued until past midnight. Eventually, people started drifting off to bed, tired but happy. Daniel left reluctantly, promising to come back first thing in the morning. He had his own place in town, but had been spending more and more time at the ranch. After everyone was asleep, I went to the kitchen to clean up the last few dishes. That's when I noticed the light blinking on the phone by the door. I'd missed a call. Actually, I'd missed several calls. And there was a voicemail from Thomas Brennan, Aunt Mary's lawyer. Lauren, this is Tom Brennan. I apologise for calling so late on Christmas, but something has come up regarding Mary's estate. I received a letter that was meant to be delivered to you on this date exactly. It's been in my possession for over a year per Mary's instructions. Could you please call me back when you get this? It's important. I stared at the phone, my heart suddenly racing. A letter from Mary, to be delivered exactly 1 year after her death. I walked to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the porch. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was visible in the moonlight. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the driveway, my breath clouding in the cold air. When I opened the mailbox, there it was. A thick envelope hand-delivered by Tom Brennan himself, marked with today's date, Lauren Price, to be opened Christmas 2025, in Aunt Mary's handwriting. A letter was waiting in the mail, I stood at the mailbox for a long moment, holding the envelope like it might burn me. The night was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the pines. Above me, the stars were impossibly bright. I walked back to the house slowly, my footsteps crunching in the snow. Inside, the fire was dying down to embers, casting a soft orange glow across the living room. Everyone was asleep upstairs. I was alone with this letter, this final message from a woman who'd loved me when I needed it most. I sat in Aunt Mary's rocking chair and turned on the small reading lamp. The envelope was thick, several pages inside. My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was shaky. She'd written this when she was already sick, but unmistakably hers. "My dearest Lauren," it began. "If you're reading this, it means a year has passed since I left this world. I hope that year has been kinder to you than the years before it. I hope you found peace in this place I've left you. I hope you filled it with love. By now you probably know some truths about your family that were kept from you, about your mother and me, about the ways we failed each other, about the ways she failed you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from that while I was alive. I'm sorry I let pride and hurt keep me away when you needed someone. But I want you to know something important. Your mother isn't a villain. She's a wounded woman who built walls so high she forgot there was a world outside them. When we were children, she was the sweetest, most loving girl you could imagine. But abandonment does things to people. It twists love into control. It turns fear into cruelty. I tried to tell her that. I tried to help her see what she was doing to you, but she couldn't hear it. And rather than keep trying, I gave up. I walked away. I told myself it was because she pushed me out, but the truth is, I let myself be pushed. I chose my pride over fighting for you. That's my great regret, Lauren. Not the lost years with Judith, but the lost years with you. So I'm giving you this place in the hopes that you'll do what I couldn't, that you'll heal what I left broken, that you'll build something beautiful here, not just a home for yourself, but a sanctuary for others who need to know they matter. This ranch gave me peace when I needed it most. Let it do the same for you. But don't stop there. Share it. Open it. Let it become a place where people can learn that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, about choosing love even when it's hard, about forgiving even when you have every right to walk away. You have a gift, Lauren. You see people, really see them. You understand pain because you've lived it. Use that. Build something that honors what we both lost and what you found. And please, if you can find it in your heart, forgive your mother, not because she deserves it, but because you do. Because carrying that weight will only make you into something you're not. I love you, sweet girl. I always did. Even when we were apart, you were in my heart every single day. Build something beautiful here. With all my love, Aunt Mary. The pages were blurred by my tears. I read the letter 3 times, each time finding something new. Some wisdom I'd missed. Some grace I needed. Build something beautiful here. I'd been so focused on healing my own family that I hadn't thought beyond that. But Mary was right. This place, this sanctuary could be more than just mine. It could be for everyone who'd ever felt invisible, ever been told they weren't enough, ever been abandoned by people who should have loved them. Women like my mother, who built walls because the alternative was too painful. Women like me who spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Women like Mary who sacrificed everything and still ended up alone. I sat there as the fire died completely, my mind racing with possibilities. A foundation, a retreat, a place where women could come when their families failed them, where they could heal, where they could learn that they deserved better. Mary's home. The idea crystallized so clearly it felt like Mary was sitting beside me, whispering in my ear. This was what she'd meant. This was the beautiful thing I was supposed to build. I heard footsteps on the stairs. My mother appeared in her bathrobe, her face puffy from sleep. "I heard you come in," she said. I couldn't sleep. Is everything okay? I held up the letter. It's from Aunt Mary. She left instructions for it to be delivered tonight. Mum's face went pale. What does it say? I handed it to her. You should read it. She sat on the couch and read slowly, her hands trembling. I watched emotions play across her face. Pain, shame, grief, and finally something that looked like relief. When she finished, she was crying silently. She forgave me. Even after everything I did, she forgave me. She loved you, Mum. She never stopped. I don't deserve that. None of us deserve grace. That's what makes it grace. She looked at me, this woman who'd hurt me so deeply and who was trying so hard to change. What are you going to do? I'm going to build what she asked me to build, a foundation, a place for women who need to know they matter, women who've been abandoned or rejected or made to feel invisible. I paused. Women like us. Mum's breath caught. You'd include me in that? You were abandoned too, Mum, by your mother, by your own fear. You need healing just as much as anyone else. She started crying harder. I don't know how to help with something like that. Then learn. We'll both learn, together. She stood and crossed to me, pulling me into a tight hug. Thank you, she whispered, for not giving up on me, for seeing past what I did to who I could become. That's what family does. We stood there in the dark living room, holding each other, both of us crying for different reasons, for lost time, for found grace, for the possibility of redemption. When we finally pulled apart, Mum looked at the letter again. She knew, she said. Mary knew you'd do this, that you'd take her gift and make it into something bigger. She believed in me when no one else did. I believe in you now. And looking at my mother's face, I could see she meant it. And that's when it all came full circle. Morning came with golden light streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee brewing. I'd slept maybe 2 hours curled on the couch with Mary's letter folded carefully on the table beside me. My mother had gone upstairs around 3, promising she'd help me share the news with everyone. By 8 o'clock, the house was awake and buzzing. People emerged from bedrooms drawn to the kitchen by the promise of breakfast. Daniel arrived early, letting himself in with the key I'd given him weeks ago. He found me standing at the stove making pancakes, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Did you sleep at all? He asked, kissing my cheek. A little. I have something to tell everyone. Something important. The letter. How did you know? I saw you walking to the mailbox last night. And you have that look. Like something changed. By 9, everyone was gathered in the living room with coffee and plates of food. I stood by the fireplace, the letter in my hands, and suddenly felt nervous. I want to thank you all for being here, I started, for taking this journey with me, for believing that families can heal even when they're broken. Mum was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dad beside her. Ethan and Sarah in the armchair, her hand resting on her belly. My chosen family scattered around the room, listening intently. Last night I received a final letter from Aunt Mary. She wrote it before she died and asked her lawyer to deliver it exactly 1 year later. I held it up. She asked me to build something beautiful here. Not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. I explained my plan for Mary's Home Foundation. A retreat centre for women who'd been abandoned, rejected, or made to feel invisible by their families. A place to heal, to learn, to remember their worth. I want this to be Mary's legacy, I said, and mine, and ours, all of us. There was silence for a moment. Then Aunt Carol started clapping, and soon everyone joined in. My mother stood up slowly. I have something I need to do, she said. Something I should have done a long time ago. She left the room and came back a minute later holding a small velvet box. She walked to me, her hand shaking slightly. This was Mary's, she said, opening the box. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant shaped like a rose. She wore it every day when we were young. Our grandmother gave it to her before she died. Mary left it to me in her will, along with a note saying I should give it to you when the time was right. She lifted the necklace from the box. It should have been yours all along. I was just too proud and hurt to give it to you until now. She fastened it around my neck, and I felt the weight of it settle against my collarbone. A connection to Mary, to my mother, to all the women in our line who'd loved imperfectly but truly. Thank you, Mom. She hugged me and I heard her whisper, I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago. When we pulled apart, Ethan was standing. He cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but determined. I need to say something too, he said. He looked around the room. I owe everyone here an apology, but especially Lauren. I spent my whole life believing success meant money and status and being better than everyone else. I thought I deserved more because I worked harder, earned more, achieved more. Sarah squeezed his hand encouragingly. But I was wrong, he continued. I almost destroyed the most important things in my life because I couldn't see past my own ego. I tried to profit from Aunt Mary's death. I resented Lauren's success. I perpetuated the same toxic patterns our mother created. He looked at Mum. Sorry, Mum, but it's true. Mum nodded, accepting it. Lauren didn't just inherit a ranch, Ethan said. She inherited wisdom and grace and the ability to see people for who they really are. And instead of using that power to hurt us back, she used it to heal. She forgave us when we didn't deserve it. She kept trying when we kept failing. His voice cracked. You taught me what family really means, Lauren. Not performance, not perfection, just showing up, being honest, trying to do better. He wiped his eyes. I was selfish. I almost destroyed what mattered most. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I crossed to him and hugged him. He held on tight and I felt him shaking. We all needed to learn, I said softly. All of us. Sarah came over and wrapped her arms around both of us. You taught him what family really means, she said to me. You taught all of us. The room was full of people crying now. Happy tears, healing tears. The kind of tears that come when old wounds finally close. Dad stood and raised his coffee cup. To Mary, he said, who saw what we couldn't, and to Lauren, who finished what Mary started. To Mary and Lauren, everyone echoed. We spent the rest of the morning together talking about the foundation. What it would look like, who it would serve, how we could all contribute. Ethan offered his real estate expertise for free. Mum volunteered to help with fundraising. Daniel said he'd provide veterinary services for any therapy animals we might bring in. My chosen family offered time skill stories. Everyone wanted to be part of this. As I looked around the room at these people, some related by blood, some by choice, all of them family now, I felt something I'd been searching for my entire life. I felt like I belonged, not because I'd earned it or proved myself or met someone's conditions, but simply because I existed, because I'd chosen love over bitterness, because I'd built a table big enough for everyone. Mum caught my eye from across the room and smiled. A real smile, not performed, not calculated, just genuine happiness for her daughter. I smiled back, and this time the tears were of peace. Peace isn't a destination. It's a practice. That's what I learned in the year that followed. December 2026 arrived with snow and clear skies and a sense of completion that felt almost dreamlike. 2 years had passed since that first painful Christmas when my family showed up uninvited. 2 years of hard work, healing, and transformation. Today, Mary's home was officially opening its doors. I stood in front of the newly renovated guest cottage, which now served as the main gathering space for the foundation. The architect had kept Mary's vision intact, while making it functional for groups. Large windows looked out at the mountains. a commercial kitchen where women could learn to cook together, a library filled with books about healing and resilience, art therapy rooms, counselling offices, and upstairs 6 bedrooms for women who needed a safe place to stay. The main house remained my home mine, and Daniel's now. We'd gotten married in May, a small ceremony with both families present. Mum had cried. Dad had walked me down the aisle. Ethan had been Daniel's best man, which felt impossible and perfect at the same time. Now people were arriving for the opening ceremony. Local officials, donors, potential residents, and most importantly, the people who'd made this possible. Margaret came with Mrs. Kim, both of them, for them serving on the foundation's board. Aunt Carol and Steve had driven up from Cleveland. Jamie and her girlfriend now engaged themselves. The Hartleys, Dennis, all the people from that first Christmas who'd shown me what chosen family meant. And my family. My complicated, imperfect, trying family. Mum arrived early, carrying containers of food she'd spent days preparing. Over the past year, she'd found her purpose here. She ran the baking program, teaching women who came to Mary's home how to make bread, cookies, and cakes. But more than that, she taught them that it was okay to make mistakes, to start over, to knead out your frustrations and create something nourishing from flour and water and time. She was staying in one of the rooms upstairs, the first resident of Mary's home. When I'd suggested it 6 months ago, she'd been shocked. "But I'm your mother. This is for people who need help." "You need help too, Mum. We all do." She'd agreed to a 3-month residency, participating in all the programs as both a teacher and a student. Learning to cook without perfection. Learning to talk about her childhood without shame. Learning to accept love without conditions. Watching her transformation had been one of the greatest gifts of my life. Dad was out back tending to Mary's rose garden, which he'd lovingly restored. He came every month to prune water and care for the roses. "Mary started this," he'd said. "I'm just making sure it continues." Ethan arrived with Sarah and baby Mary, who was now 3 months old and the light of everyone's life. He'd kept his promise, providing free financial consulting to every woman who came through the program, helping them understand credit budgeting independence, giving them tools their families had often denied them. He and Sarah had become regular visitors, bringing Mary to see her namesake's home. Watching him hold his daughter, seeing the gentleness he'd learned, gave me hope that cycles could break, that we could be better than what we were raised to be. At noon, we gathered everyone in front of the main sign, hand-carved wood painted in warm colours. Mary's home, a sanctuary for women who were told they weren't enough. I stood before it, holding a candle. Beside me, on a small table, was a framed photograph of Aunt Mary taken in this very garden 30 years ago. She was smiling, holding a rose, looking exactly how I remembered her from my childhood, before she disappeared from my life. Daniel squeezed my hand. "You ready?" "I think so." I addressed the gathered crowd, my voice steadier than I expected. 2 years ago, I was sitting in an apartment in Seattle, feeling invisible and alone. My family had uninvited me from Christmas, and I thought that was the worst thing that could happen. But it turned out to be the best thing, because it forced me to rebuild, to redefine what family meant, to create something new from something broken. I looked at my mother, who was crying quietly, and my father, who nodded encouragingly, at Ethan holding his daughter close. This place exists because of a woman who loved me when I needed it most. Aunt Mary saw past my family's failures and loved me anyway. She left me this ranch not because of money, but because she believed I could turn pain into purpose, hurt into healing. I gestured to the building behind me. Mary's home will serve women aged 40 and older who've experienced family rejection, abandonment, or emotional neglect. Women who were told they weren't good enough, weren't successful enough, weren't perfect enough. Women who learned to make themselves small so others could feel big. My voice cracked slightly. Women like my mother, like Me, like so many of us who are still learning that our worth isn't conditional. I lit the candle in front of Mary's photograph. Aunt Mary, this is for you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me the space to build something beautiful. Others came forward to light their own candles. Mum, Dad, Ethan, my chosen family. Soon there were dozens of small flames flickering in the cold December air, reflecting off the snow. The ceremony ended and people filtered inside for food and tours. I stayed outside for a moment longer, looking at the house, the garden, the mountains beyond. All I ever wanted was a seat at the table, a place where I belonged, where I mattered, where I was seen. Turns out I just had to build my own table. And now this table had room for everyone. Everyone who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Everyone who'd been told they weren't enough. Everyone who'd spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. This table had room for all of us. Daniel came back outside, wrapping his coat around my shoulders. Come inside, you're freezing. In a minute, he stood beside me, patient and present in the way he always was. Behind us, through the windows, I could see people laughing, talking, eating, building community, finding connection. My mother was showing someone how to braid bread dough. My father was explaining roses to a woman who looked lost. Ethan was holding baby Mary up to see the Christmas lights. This was family. Messy, imperfect, beautiful family. I touched the rose pendant at my neck, the one that connected me to Mary, to my mother, to all the women who'd come before us, who'd loved imperfectly, but tried. Ready? Daniel asked. Ready. We walked back inside together into the warmth and light and laughter, into the home I'd built, into the family I'd chosen, into the life I'd created from broken pieces. And somewhere deep inside, past the old wounds and the new scars, past the pain and the healing, I felt it. Finally, truly, completely. I knew I was finally home. If this story touched your heart, you're not alone. Thousands of people have shared how Lauren's journey mirrors their own experiences of feeling invisible in their families, of building new definitions of belonging, of learning that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. This story reminds us that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who show up when everyone else walks away. Sometimes it's about building a table big enough for everyone who was ever told they didn't belong. Maybe you have your own story of family estrangement. Maybe you're the Lauren in your family still waiting to be seen. Or maybe you're the Judith realizing too late the damage caused by conditional love. Whatever your story is, I want to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between begging for acceptance and building your own path? How did that decision change your life? And here's something to think about. If you could build your own Mary's home, what would it look like? Who would you invite to your table? If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe in second chances and the power of chosen family, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about resilience, redemption, and the complicated beauty of human relationships. Remember, your worth isn't determined by who accepts you. It's determined by who you choose to become when you finally accept yourself. Thank you for listening to Lauren's story. Thank you for being part of this community. And thank you for believing that broken families can heal one honest conversation at a time. Until next time, keep building your table. Keep making room. Keep showing up. Because that's what real family does.